In 1989, a 22-year-old named Eloise Lindsay set out on a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, hoping it would help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Instead, the trip would end with Eloise lost in the woods for nearly 3 weeks, convinced that something was following her through the trees. She had just graduated from college, a milestone that for many signals the start of a clear career path. But for Eloise, holding her degree felt less like a map and more like a blank page. She genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do next with her life. Being an experienced backpacker, she felt the call of the wilderness. She believed that a long, solitary journey through nature would give her the time and space she needed to think, to reflect, and to hopefully find some clarity. So she came up with a plan. When Eloise laid out this detailed plan for her parents, they weren't particularly concerned for her safety. They knew their daughter. They knew she was a capable and seasoned backpacker who had successfully completed similar trips before. They trusted her skills and her judgment. So, with their blessing, they wished her well and told her they'd see her when she got back. On November 4th, Eloise shouldered her pack and set out to begin her journey. The first couple of days were exactly what she had hoped for. The weather was beautiful, the autumn scenery along the trail was breathtaking, and the solitude was perfect. She had all the time in the world to be by herself, to look inward, and to think deeply about what her future might hold. But on the morning of the third day, everything changed. She woke up inside her tent, which she had pitched just off the trail the night before, and was immediately hit with an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling that she couldn't place. There was no obvious reason for it. She did a mental inventory, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had she forgotten a crucial piece of gear? Was there something about her route she was misremembering? But nothing came to mind. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just a strange mood. She decided the best thing to do was to get moving, to pack up her camp and start hiking. She figured the physical activity and the change of scenery would help clear her head. So she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cool morning air. As she began breaking down her campsite, she casually scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, it was just a natural habit for a hiker, and that's when she saw it. She could have sworn she saw the figure of a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. She blinked, doing a double take, and stared at the spot. It was broad daylight, and she was near a popular trail. The idea of seeing another person wasn't unbelievable in itself. But the way he was standing there, just watching, felt odd. When she looked again, the person was gone. She stood frozen for a minute, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen him. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Did she really see someone? If there was another hiker there, why were they hiding? Why wouldn't they just say hello? Out here in the relative wilderness, hikers usually acknowledged each other. But this person never showed themselves again. As she stood there, trying to decide what to do, she felt a powerful, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. And it felt exactly like the sense of dread she had woken up with inside her tent. A chilling thought entered her mind. Was her intuition, her sixth sense, trying to warn her that she was being observed by a predator? She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the feeling was undeniable. Alone in the middle of the woods, even an experienced hiker like Eloise couldn't help but feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact that this man, if he was real, wouldn't show himself again made her feel threatened. The feeling quickly escalated into panic. She abandoned any attempt at being neat and orderly and started stuffing her gear into her pack as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking. As soon as her pack was on her back, she took off down the trail, walking quickly away from the campsite and the man she saw in the woods. As she hurried along the path, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind her. She kept whipping her head around, her heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But the trail behind her was always empty. Yet, that visceral feeling of being watched, that deep sense of dread, it just wouldn't go away. Her fast walk turned into a jog, and her jog turned into an all-out run. She realized she was in a very remote section of the trail, miles from any town or road. She was nowhere near her next planned stop. A new thought took hold of her. She had to get off this trail. She had to get to a road, to civilization, to safety, as quickly as humanly possible. She weighed her options. She could stay on the trail, but it would be many more miles and likely take her well into the night before she reached any kind of town. Or she could take a shortcut. She had a map, and she believed there was a road that ran parallel to the trail, but it was far down the mountain. Getting to it would mean leaving the marked path and bushwhacking through dense, unfamiliar wilderness. But the threat of the person or thing she felt was following her was so intense, so real to her, that she couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out in the woods being stalked. So she made a fateful decision. She stepped off the trail and started running straight down the steep, wooded mountainside. It wasn't long before she started to hear actual sounds coming from behind her. She was certain it was the person who was following her. She'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. She'd slow down, trying to listen as she walked, and she'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the leaves far behind her. Again, she'd turn and see nothing. But she was absolutely certain someone was back there stalking her. And then came a new sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a deep male voice, but it wasn't a language she could recognize. It was more like a grunt or a yell. Her heart rate soared. She was in full-blown panic now, crashing through the wilderness as fast as she could, praying she was headed towards the road. But after running for miles deep into the middle of nowhere, she hadn't found a road. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark. She knew she was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to make camp. She knew that somewhere out there in the blackness of the woods was the person or thing that was hunting her. She was all alone, with no way to call for help. This was 1989, long before everyone carried a cell phone. With trembling hands, she set up her tent, crawled inside, zipped it up, and lay there, listening, hoping for silence. But sure enough, within minutes, she started to hear those sounds again. The low, audible grunts from somewhere in the forest. And then, the sound of heavy footsteps, walking in a wide circle around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she heard it. The footsteps never came right up to her tent. There was always some distance, but they were always there. Finally, the sun came up. The moment there was enough light to see, she scrambled out of her tent, packed it up in a frenzy, and started running again, desperately hoping she was moving in the direction of civilization. And all through that day, the terrifying cycle repeated. She had the constant sense that someone was watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, but saw nothing when she turned. She heard that low, grunting voice from somewhere in the trees, but could never see who or what was making the sound. As the sun began to set again, she still hadn't found the road. She hadn't found a trail. She knew she couldn't even try to backtrack. If she turned around, she was bound to run straight into the very thing she was trying to escape. So once again, she found a spot to set up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She got inside her tent, and just like the night before, as soon as she was lying down, she heard the heavy footsteps circling in the woods and the low, audible sound that she couldn't place. A couple of days later, the day Eloise was supposed to meet her friend at the 7-day mark, she never showed up. Her friend waited at the rendezvous point for several hours, growing more and more concerned. Finally, when it was clear Eloise wasn't coming, her friend left the trail, found a phone, and contacted the authorities to file a missing person report. The police immediately launched a massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she was supposed to be. For the next 14 days, hundreds of police officers, search and rescue volunteers, and helicopters scoured the area. But they found no sign of Eloise at all. After 2 full weeks of searching, the police had to make the difficult decision to call off the official search. 2 days after the search was terminated, which was now 23 days after Eloise had first set off on her hike, a hunter was out in a remote area near the trail. He stumbled upon Eloise propped up against a tree. She was totally emaciated, severely dehydrated, and delirious, but she was alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter. In her confused state, she thought he was the person who had been following her. But when she finally realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was taken to a hospital, and aside from her severe dehydration and malnourishment, she was physically okay. In multiple interviews and in her official police statement, she detailed her terrifying ordeal. She insisted that she had been chased for nearly 3 weeks through the woods and that she had no idea who it was or why they were chasing her. Then she added another bizarre detail. She said that right before she was found, this person or thing that was following her got so close to her on a couple of occasions that she became absolutely terrified. She was so scared that she made a desperate choice. She ditched her backpack. Her backpack contained all of her life-saving equipment, her tent, her sleeping bag, her food and water. She threw it all away so she could be lighter, so she could run faster. Tapas. You have to imagine the level of fear a person would have to be in to willingly abandon the one thing they need to survive in the wilderness. After ditching her pack, with no supplies, no food, and no water, she stumbled across a tree in the middle of nowhere. And wedged inside a hollow in the trunk was a stash of donuts and pound cake. She took the food, and between that and water from a stream she found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before the hunter found her. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was just as baffled. Some believe she may have had a mental break, that she got lost, and her paranoia created an imaginary pursuer. Others, including some park rangers familiar with that part of the trail, believe it's possible she was stalked by so-called wild men, feral people who are said to live deep in the mountains, according to local legend. But as of today, there is no official explanation for what happened to Eloise Lindsay. On the 7th of June, 1951, 2 families from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the McGees and the Crosses, decided to spend a beautiful day together. They met up at the Santa Fe ski basin for a picnic to enjoy the fresh mountain air. During the summer months, when there's no snow on the ground, the ski basin is a very popular spot for hikers. The terrain is rugged, and the views from the top are absolutely incredible. But on this particular day, the 2 families just wanted to have a relaxing picnic at the base of the mountain, looking up at the slopes. As the parents began unpacking the car and setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. There was Larry and Janet McGee, a brother and sister who were 7 and 5 years old, and their friend, 3-year-old Stephen Cross. After they had finished laying out the blanket and the food, the parents looked around and realized the kids were gone. They had just seen them playing nearby only a minute or 2 before, so they figured they couldn't have gone very far. They started looking around, calling out their names, but there was no answer. Their calls became a little more urgent as they began to worry. They expanded their search, looking farther and farther from the picnic spot. They realized the only place the children could have gone was up into the dense woods that bordered the area. But the terrain there was very steep and very rugged. It seemed impossible that 3 young children, one of them a toddler, could have gotten very far up the mountain. And they weren't responding to their parents' calls. A terrible thought began to creep in. Maybe they had been abducted. One of the parents ran to the main building of the ski resort where a staff member was on duty and used the phone to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they immediately set up huge, powerful spotlights and aimed them up at the mountain. The idea was that if the kids had somehow wandered up into the woods and gotten lost, they would see the bright lights and hopefully walk down towards them. After setting up the lights, the police began a thorough search of the mountainside, hoping that the children were simply lost and not the victims of a kidnapping. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers yelling out the children's names, they heard nothing back. They found no sign of the kids. They searched all through the night, and as the hours passed, the grim possibility of an abduction seemed more and more likely. By the following afternoon, things were really starting to look bleak. There was still no sign of the kids anywhere. That's when a searcher, who was way outside of the primary search area, made a startling discovery. He was about 3.5 miles away from the picnic site and thousands of feet up in elevation. He was getting ready to leave his assigned section when he saw something out of the corner of his eye that looked like a person. He turned and saw one of the children poking their head up from behind a large, downed log. The searcher ran over, and sure enough, all 3 kids were huddled together inside the hollow log. They were dirty and scared, but they were all okay. As the searcher was picking them up and radioing in the incredible news, he couldn't help but wonder how in the world these 3 little kids had managed to get so far away and so high up the mountain. Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters, reunited with their tearful parents and checked over by a doctor who confirmed they were okay, the police asked them the question on everyone's mind, how did you get all the way up there? Larry, the oldest of the group at 7 years old, was the one who answered. It took him a minute, but eventually he said that they had been playing near the picnic area and had wandered just a little way into the tree line. All of a sudden, he said, a bear came out from behind a tree and started chasing them. According to Larry, the 3 of them ran for their lives 3.5 miles up a steep mountain until they found the log, which they jumped inside of to hide. He claimed the bear was patrolling the area looking for them. But then Larry added another detail. He said that in addition to the bear, they were especially scared of the gorilla that was also walking around the area looking for them too. Now, it's easy to dismiss a child's story. You could say the gorilla they saw was just one of the searchers. But there were no searchers in that specific remote area near the log until the exact moment they were found. It was a last-ditch effort to expand the search, and it was a miracle they were located at all. Larry insisted that he and the other kids saw the gorilla and the bear on the first day and during the first night, long before any search teams were that far up the mountain. As for the bear, sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin are rare, but not unheard of. However, if a real bear had been chasing 3 small children, it would have caught them. There's no way 3 kids, especially a 3-year-old, could outrun a bear going uphill. So either there wasn't a bear or it was some other animal that just looked like a bear to them. But even if you discount the animals entirely and say the kids just got lost, there's still the problem of the distance. To cover 3.5 miles uphill through extremely rugged mountain terrain is an incredible feat for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. For a 3-year-old, it's practically impossible to do in a 2-4-hour period without help. The only way it might be possible is if the children were in absolute fear for their lives. The adrenaline rush from that kind of terror could potentially give them the strength and endurance to cover that distance. This lends a strange credibility to their story that they were, in fact, running for their lives. But what were they running from? A bear? A gorilla? We'll likely never know. Because the children were found alive and safe, the case was closed and everyone moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was a force to be reckoned with in college football. He was arguably one of the most successful college quarterbacks in history, leading his team to 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also known for being one of the toughest players on the field. Most quarterbacks are trained to avoid big hits, to slide or run out of bounds. Not Cullen. He stood 6'2", weighed 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he actually wanted to get hit and that he would hit back. His coaches hated it, but his teammates loved his fearless, aggressive style. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. During his junior year in college, he broke his collarbone but didn't tell anyone. He played through an entire playoff series with the injury and still led his team to victory. After college, however, Cullen's professional football career didn't reach the same heights. He had brief stints with two NFL teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but he didn't get much playing time. He could see the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to make it in the NFL. So he left for Europe to play in the European Football League. But when that career also began to sputter out around 2009, he came back to the United States and joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. Cullen's passion for the game was still as strong as ever, but he knew that playing at this level meant his career was effectively over. Around the same time he was hanging up his football cleats for good, he met a woman named Jennifer who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player, and in many ways, she was just as competitive and athletic as Cullen. They were a perfect match. They got married in 2010, and Cullen, this big, tough quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar. He was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. It was a huge turning point for him, a moment where he was consciously putting his football past behind him to start a new life and build a family. The newlyweds moved into a house in Michigan, had 2 children, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. By all accounts, Cullen was thriving in his life after football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family planned a 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan. Cullen and Jennifer decided to join them with their kids. They rented a cabin near the campsite where Jennifer's family was staying. The whole weekend was wonderful. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time fishing and relaxing. On May 26th, the last night of the trip, Cullen, who had recently bought a new pontoon boat that he was incredibly proud of, wanted to go out one last time. He just wanted to fish for another 30 or 45 minutes before they packed up and ended the weekend. So Cullen put on his fishing waders and his jacket, grabbed his fishing pole, and had his family drive him to the set of stairs that led down to the water where his boat was docked. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes. He told them to pick him up at the next boat ramp downriver and that he would call them when he was ready. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer's phone rang. It was Cullen. She expected him to say he was ready to be picked up. But when she answered, Cullen's voice was frantic. He told her that he was being followed by 2 men. He said he was out on the water in his pontoon boat, but there were 2 men in the tree line on the shore. He said he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, and they had been following him for some time. Before Jennifer could even process what he was saying and ask a question, Cullen said something incredibly strange. He told her he was going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. Then he hung up. Jennifer immediately tried calling him back over and over, but he didn't pick up. She was left feeling totally shocked and confused. What stood out most to her was the raw fear in his voice. Fear was not an emotion she associated with Cullen. This was a man who was a beast on the football field, who seemed fearless. For him to sound that scared and to be talking about people stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. She immediately called 911, described where he was on the Baldwin River, and the police said they would send someone out right away. After getting off the phone with the police, Jennifer called her family and told them about the bizarre and terrifying phone call from Cullen. Her brother, Matt, decided to try calling Cullen himself. This time, Cullen answered. Matt asked him, "Cullen, where are you?" Cullen replied, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." Matt tried to get more information, asking if he was still on his boat or if he was on land. All Cullen said was, "It's getting pretty rough out here," and then he hung up again. Matt called Jennifer and told her about the call, but it didn't provide any clarity. So Jennifer and her family decided the best thing to do was to drive to the boat ramp where Cullen had originally said he wanted to be picked up. They hoped he might somehow make his way there. When they arrived, Cullen was nowhere to be seen. They got out of their car and yelled his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Shortly after, a police car pulled up. This was one of the locations Jennifer had mentioned to the 911 operator. The police officer took an official statement from Jennifer, and at that point they filed an official missing person report for Cullen Finnerty. Before starting the physical search, the police contacted Cullen's wireless service provider and asked them to ping his cell phone. A service provider can roughly triangulate a phone's location based on which cell towers it's connecting to. The results they got back were bizarre. The last 4 locations that were pinged for Cullen's phone were up to 4 miles apart from each other. This was strange because the idea that Cullen could have covered that much ground, moving 4, 5, or even 7 miles in a short amount of time through very rugged wooded terrain, didn't seem possible. What was even stranger was that when police looked at these 4 points on a map, each one was either right next to a paved road or would have required him to cross a paved road to get there. If he was lost and scared, why would he keep crossing roads, which represented safety, and plunging back into the wilderness? As strange as the data was, it gave the police a solid starting point. They dispatched search teams to each of the 4 locations and also began combing the banks of the river where he was last seen. Within an hour, they found his boat. It was beached on the side of the river, a little ways downstream from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached or had just drifted ashore. Cullen was not in it, and a search of the immediate area found no sign of him. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the boat was found told police he heard screaming or yelling coming from that area around the same time Cullen went missing. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of volunteers searched the areas where his phone had pinged and along the river, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after he went missing, they found his body. He was located less than half a mile from a paved road in an area situated between the 4 cell phone ping locations. He was lying face down, his right arm tucked under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching a handful of grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming from his nose, but other than that, there was no sign of significant trauma anywhere on his body. He appeared to be fully clothed, but investigators noted that the strap on his waders was badly twisted. This was a significant detail. A twisted strap like that would have been very uncomfortable, something a person would almost certainly fix before starting a fishing trip. This, combined with the bizarre statement he made to his wife about taking his clothes off, led some to speculate that at some point during his ordeal, his clothes had come off and had been put back on again in a hurry, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone was found in his front pocket. Cullen's initial autopsy was inconclusive. There was no obvious cause of death. Later, a more detailed analysis determined he had died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. Many people believe Cullen's death was a tragic result of CTE, a brain injury caused by the years of repeated head trauma from playing football. CTE can lead to paranoia and confusion. Perhaps he had a severe paranoid episode, believed someone was chasing him, got lost and scared, and in his panicked state, somehow ended up dying. There was a minor incident in 2011 where Cullen had briefly thought someone was following him, but it had passed. But even if it was a fit of paranoia, why didn't he stop when he reached the paved roads? A road represents help and safety. His instinct should have been to seek help, not to run back into the woods. And why did he leave the safety of his boat in the first place? On the other hand, if he really was being followed, why would his pursuers allow him to make phone calls? Why would they prompt him to take his clothes off? It makes no sense. Both theories are full of holes, leaving a tragic and profound mystery. Thank you so much for watching. What makes stories like these so unsettling is that they don't feel impossible. Even today, people still disappear in forests, national parks, and remote wilderness areas under circumstances nobody can fully explain. And in all three of these cases, the victims described the exact same terrifying feeling that something was following them just beyond the trees. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe out in places where there are no cameras, no witnesses, and no help for miles around, there really was someone or something out there with them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next time you find yourself completely alone in the woods and suddenly get the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to trust that feeling. On paper, Austin Harrouff had the kind of childhood most people would envy. He was born on the 21st of December, 1996, to a dentist, father, and a pharmacist mother, and grew up in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country. It was the kind of place filled with luxury homes, sunshine, and opportunity. By 2021, more than 40 billionaires lived in the county, and for most of Austin's early life, everything seemed stable, comfortable, and normal. But in 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, that stability suddenly cracked. His parents announced they were getting a divorce. For Austin and his younger sister, Haley, who was only a year younger than him, the news was a massive shock. And what made it even more overwhelming was how quickly everything changed afterward. Within that same year, both of their parents had already started new relationships. Suddenly, the life Austin had always known felt completely different almost overnight. Now, of course, this was a huge shock to Austin and to his younger sister Haley, who was only a year younger than him. But, by all accounts, they both adjusted to their new normal relatively quickly. A big part of that was because the kids didn't have to move out. They got to stay in the familiar family home with their mom, which provided a sense of stability. Their father did move out, but he made sure to get a home that was very close by, so he was never far away. The family dynamic had changed, but the core pieces were still there. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and he didn't just attend, he absolutely excelled. From day one, he was placed into all advanced classes, and even within these challenging courses filled with the brightest students, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. He was smart, dedicated, and driven. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He stood at about 6 feet tall and weighed a solid 200 pounds. So, naturally, he gravitated towards sports. He played football for all 4 years, he was in high school, a significant commitment. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also took up wrestling. But despite his size and his willingness to play these very rough, very physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive person by nature. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. On game days, they would try to get him worked up, try to make him mad, hoping that it would inspire him to go out on the field and just smash some people. But it never really worked. Because Austin was just Austin. He was a laid-back, easygoing guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than he was in hurting them. Towards the end of his high school years, this desire to help people became a central focus for him. He became almost obsessed with trying to identify a career path that would allow him to help the most people possible. And he was so genuinely passionate about this that whenever he spoke about it, a huge, involuntary smile would just appear on his face. It was impossible to miss his enthusiasm. Because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy and positive disposition, his father very lovingly started referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's high school graduation in 2015, a letter arrived in the mail that would set the course for his future. It was from Florida State University, and it was a letter of acceptance, informing him that he had been admitted into their prestigious 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being the ultimate way he could fulfill his dream of helping people, So, being accepted into this very competitive program was like a best-case scenario come to life. The news sent waves of excitement through the family. Austin and his parents, his sister, they were all absolutely elated. That summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud nine, living out the final carefree days before heading off to college. He spent a lot of time with his family, soaking up the moments with his parents and his sister. He hung out with his friends, making memories they would all look back on. Then, finally, at the end of the summer, the day came. His family packed all of his belongings into the car, and they all drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was located. They helped him move into his new dorm room, setting up his new life. And afterwards, they gave him a big hug, wished him good luck, and they left. I'm sure on that long ride back home, his family members thought to themselves that Austin was doing so great. He wasn't just ready for college, he was ready to be an adult. He was ready to live on his own, to be responsible, to chase his dreams. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that belief seemed to be entirely accurate. On the surface, he was thriving. Austin got excellent grades in his demanding pre-med courses. He met a nice girlfriend. And even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football anymore, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. He became passionate about fitness and even built a decent-sized social media presence around his bodybuilding journey. From the outside, he was the picture of success. But underneath all of this public success that Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling anyone. He kept a journal, and in its private pages, he documented a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy. This feeling was caused primarily by his perception that his peers didn't accept him, that he didn't fit in. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy, if he could just be more assertive and more outgoing, then more people would embrace him. They would like him. They would finally accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started to self-medicate, abusing different substances to cope with his inner turmoil. These included things like alcohol and marijuana, but also Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a powerful stimulant drug typically used to treat people with attention deficit disorder, and he was using it without a prescription. He also began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he tried MDMA, which is a kind of cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible, even likely, that he was taking other drugs too. So, Austin began to oscillate between these two extremes. He would be on the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on, and then he would crash down to the low of his sober mind, which was a mind totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of that first school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown. And it seemed like on some level he knew it was coming, too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history paints a terrifying picture of his state of mind. It was filled with desperate questions. Questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do, and how do you know if you're crazy? He searched for how to deal with obsessive thoughts. And then there were searches that suggested a complete disconnect from reality. Do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear from these searches that he was starting to seriously question his own sanity. He was lost and scared. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State for the summer, his family immediately noticed there was something deeply wrong with him. This was not the same happy boy who had left for college less than a year ago. Within just a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his comfortable bedroom down into the family garage. When his family asked him why, he gave them a chilling explanation. He said the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night long, never stopping. And every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members. He would knock and then loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This behavior was so unbelievably weird, so totally out of character for the Austen they knew, that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, they didn't immediately jump into action. At first, the only thing they did was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austen from coming inside during his strange nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed, Austen's behavior didn't get any better. He continued to act totally bizarre, totally weird, with no rational explanation. His family became more and more convinced that he must be on drugs. To them, that was the only thing that could possibly explain this complete and total personality shift. So, when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit it. He told them he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. And so naturally, his family latched onto his drug use as being the root cause of all his strange behavior. They focused their efforts almost exclusively on that one issue, on trying to get Austen clean again, believing that if they could just stop the drugs, their old son, the happy boy, would return. But towards the end of the summer, something shifted. Austen insisted that he wasn't taking any drugs anymore. But even with that claim, he was still acting totally crazy, totally unhinged. So, around mid-August, the family decided they had to do something more drastic. They decided they had to utilize something in Florida called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals who are suspected of having a severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the request of their loved one. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed by medical professionals to see what's going on with them. Then, at the end of those 72 hours, they're given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. It was a serious step, but they felt they had no other choice. But before the family could put this plan into motion, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austen's very close friends, someone he had known since the second grade, got an unexpected visit. Austen just showed up at his house without calling ahead or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. The friend opened the door, and Austen just stood there and asked him a single bizarre question. "What year was I born?" The friend, confused, answered, 1996. As soon as Austen heard the answer, he didn't give any reaction to it. He just turned around, walked away, and left. So, this longtime friend is standing in his doorway, watching Austen walk away, wondering what on earth is going on with this guy. Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that all about? The friend goes back inside his house, and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? After a couple of minutes, he decides he has to call Austen just to make sure he's okay. So he calls him, and Austen picks up. It's unclear exactly what they talked about on the phone, but the friend managed to convince Austen to come back to his house and just spend the day with him. In reality, the friend just wanted to keep an eye on him to make sure Austen was okay. So Austen comes back to the friend's house. Then the two of them would actually leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends who were also in town for the summer. They also met up with Austen's sister, Haley. The group decided they were going to go to the beach for the day. But on their walk to the beach, Austen tells the group that he just needs to get something from his house and that he'll meet them down at the water. At this point, the group believes Austen is more or less fine, maybe just a little off. So they say, "Okay, yep, we'll meet you down there." So Austen breaks off from the group and goes to his house. When he comes back to the beach and meets up with his friends again, he has completely changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, one on each wrist. And he had on sunglasses. As he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're at the beach in Florida in August. This is a totally weird and inappropriate outfit to have on, and immediately they start kind of giving him a hard time about it, teasing him about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. At first, he was just quiet. But then he kind of lashed out at them and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." At this, his friends immediately stopped teasing him. Everyone just said, "Okay, man. Hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal." But Austin was clearly worked up, very agitated. So his sister comes over to him and she's trying to calm him down, telling him, "Hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly seems to go back to being somewhat normal again. He turns to his sister and he says, completely seriously, "I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal." His sister is just stunned. She looks at him and says, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He looked at her and said, "I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help." You're right. So after that strange exchange, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several more hours. Then, in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and that same very close friend, the guy who saw Austin in the morning, when he asked what year he was born, they all said they had to leave. The trio leaves the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a local restaurant in town. They were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend for dinner. So, as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, getting closer and closer, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And then he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, and starts walking directly into traffic. He was just going to let a car hit him to test if he was truly immortal. His sister, with incredible reflexes, immediately was able to grab him. She pulled him back onto the sidewalk and then basically stood on his left side, physically preventing him from running out into the traffic again. She kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of the restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk into traffic. He was acting normal again. It was there at the entrance that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. The five of them then went inside Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside. They were very quickly sat at a table in the very back of the restaurant in a booth, and there happened to be a CCTV camera that was watching them while they were inside the building. So they're all sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up. He walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom. But then he stops. He doesn't go to the bathroom. He turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then he walks right out the front doors. He just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family at the table saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like absolutely nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table. Except this time, instead of pretending to go to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple of minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. So she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen. He was drinking vegetable oil straight from the bottle. And there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. So she runs up to him and she grabs the bottle of vegetable oil and puts it down. She tells him to stop. At which point, Austin does stop. Then, I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes, perhaps because he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. She watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. So, about 30 minutes after he had left that second time, Austin walks back through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, a different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down, again, like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. It would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son dearly, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. He was frustrated, scared, and confused. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" At this, Austin just stands up. He leans across the table and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then, at some point, he just lets go. He leaves the booth and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third and final time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him. So by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went. He quickly came back into the restaurant and told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was. And so, at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they had no idea where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself, or perhaps a threat to someone else. And so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from that restaurant, 3-year-old Michelle Mishkan was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 9-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So, for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Between them, they had 3 children from previous marriages, and they were just totally and completely in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. It was basically their living room. They loved having the big garage door wide open so they could wave to neighbors as they passed by and flag people down to come have a drink with them or just to chat for a while. They were known throughout the neighborhood as a very happy, loving couple that were just fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her job as a financial advisor. The two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog. And also to spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor, who lived directly across the street, was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs for them anytime they went away on a trip, and he would often go over to their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so on this particular night, he was over in his house and he was planning on going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window from across the street over near John and Michelle's property. So Jeff sits up in his bed and he kind of strains his ears to try to figure out what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. So Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door. And he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man, that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway. Then this man begins walking up the driveway. And at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle. She's standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified. And she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harrouff. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was that he heard this terrifying scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good at all. And so, instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get all the way across the street, He's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. So Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks directly at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." Now, Jeff, he's a pretty big guy himself. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. And he had no idea where John was. So he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. And as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. So Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up from that. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin start to stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, and his neck, on his back. He looks down, and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he had punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one single swing. And so Jeff believed in that moment that this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried that perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him, away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it, straight across the street, back to his house. He never once turned around to see if this guy was after him. He just figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. The operator asks if either of them are injured, and he says, yes, there's a girl laying on the ground, he beat her up, and then he says he ran over there, and he's bleeding profusely at the moment. The operator asks if he can tell if she's conscious, and he says no, it does not appear so, and that he's been stabbed in the back and is bleeding pretty bad. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious. But all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac Austin has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person or two people, if it's male or female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then, seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan. The first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, and she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. So Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are two cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot-wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground, right in front of the car. So he still can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at. And he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens. And on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place. And then he had his right arm, and he was doing something to John's face, but Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was that there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin and into John, killing John. So Dan tells Kristen, "Hold on, I'm going to tase him." And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser. And right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face with his free right hand. He was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. So Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin. But it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin's head comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back, and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again. Right as this is happening, another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, "Release the dog." And so, sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his own arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, completely unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm. And this time, when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it, so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back. And he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back. And he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do. And so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him, and the whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed that after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked, and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack, it was unharmed, and was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was lying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested. But the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's known drug abuse history, he must have been on some kind of powerful drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful. And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida and had caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana. And the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Which meant at the time of this horrific attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember. I don't know." But eventually, he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said that after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so, instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran for about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog. And Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him. But he probably came off looking completely insane. And Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch. And so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just sitting in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around, and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk. But we don't know for sure. And frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher. He has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face. And he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank. And then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Dr. Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin. And he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 8-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a police dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there are threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else in the world except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister earlier that day that he believed he was half horse. And then on a couple of other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie, but this was not a movie. This was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist and TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help. And he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon. Especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-OK, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting, because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. Thanks for watching. Cases like this are disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they force us to confront how terrifying the human mind can become when reality completely breaks apart. 2 innocent people lost their lives that night, a family was destroyed forever, and the questions surrounding what truly happened inside Austin Harrouff's mind still remain deeply unsettling to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out our other true crime stories next. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time. In the fall of 2002, a 19-year-old woman named Gemma Houghton was just starting a brand new chapter of her life. She had just moved into her dorm room at the prestigious University of Manchester in England to begin her freshman year. Like a lot of new students, her first couple of months at the university were pretty quiet and uneventful. She was really there to learn, so she spent almost all of her time with her head in the books, focusing on her studies. Because of this, she hadn't really gone out of her way to meet new people or make a lot of new friends. She was finding her footing, getting used to a new place and a new routine. But then, in early 2003, about halfway through her first year, everything changed. One afternoon, she was standing just outside of her dorm building, probably just taking a break from studying, when a boy she had never seen before walked right up to her. He was tall, very handsome, and had this incredibly charming way about him. He just smiled and introduced himself. He said his name was Ian Redmond, and he was a senior at the school. And as it turned out, he actually lived in the very same building that she did. He said he'd seen her around and just wanted to finally say hello. Now, Gemma wasn't actively looking for a boyfriend at the time. Her focus was on her education. But she couldn't deny that she was immediately attracted to Ian. There was just something about him. And Ian would later say that the feeling was completely mutual. From his perspective, the moment he saw her, he knew he had to talk to her. This one single chance encounter, a simple hello outside of a dorm, would end up blossoming into a full-fledged romantic relationship. They started spending more and more time together. They would study in the library, grab coffee between classes, and just walk around the campus talking for hours. They were a perfect match. He was a bit older and more experienced with university life, and he helped her navigate her freshman year. She brought a fresh energy and a quiet determination that he really admired. Their relationship was one of those easy, natural ones that just felt right from the very beginning. And so their love story continued well after they both left the University of Manchester. They were inseparable. 6 years after that first meeting, on Christmas Eve of 2009, Ian asked Gemma to marry him. She, of course, said yes. It was a moment they had both been dreaming of. That very same year they got engaged, the couple reached another huge milestone. For years and years, both Ian and Gemma had been incredibly diligent about saving their money. They weren't big spenders, they were focused on building a future together. They were able to pool all of their savings and buy a house together. It wasn't a brand new, glamorous house. In fact, it was a fairly beat-up cottage in a small, quiet town in England. It needed a lot of work. The paint was peeling, the floors were creaky, and the garden was overgrown. But Ian and Gemma didn't see it as a run-down house. They saw it as a canvas. They were actually very excited to do all the work themselves. They looked at this as an amazing opportunity to make the house exactly the way they wanted it, to pour their own personalities into every wall and every floorboard. More than that, it was a chance for them to spend quality time together, working as a team towards a shared goal. So, for the next 2 years, during all of their free time, on weekends and evenings after their regular jobs, Ian and Gemma would work on their home. They learned how to do plumbing, they put up drywall, they painted and sanded and gardened. It was hard, exhausting work, but they did it all together, laughing and learning along the way. They turned this dilapidated cottage into their own personal sanctuary. Then, finally, in August of 2011, right before their actual wedding day, they finished the last of the renovations. Their home was finally done. It was perfect. And so, they got married. Literally, right after their wedding reception, instead of heading straight to an airport for a honeymoon, they just moved right into their dream home that night. Their first night as a married couple was spent in the house they had built together. For the next couple of days, the newlyweds just got to enjoy being husband and wife for the very first time, all within the walls of their perfect home. It was a blissful, peaceful time. But the celebration wasn't over yet. It was time for their honeymoon. In addition to saving up for the down payment on their home, the couple had also set aside money specifically for a honeymoon. They wanted it to be an incredible, once-in-a-lifetime vacation, a surreal reward for all their years of hard work. After a lot of thought, they decided to go to Seychelles. It's this beautiful island nation in the Indian Ocean, a place that many people say has the most beautiful beaches in the entire world. It was the perfect escape. So on August 10th, the couple hopped on a plane and flew to Seychelles. When they landed, they checked into their resort, and it was unbelievable. It was this incredible place that overlooked a perfect beach with brilliant white sand and crystal clear turquoise waters. It was like something out of a postcard. After getting checked in and dropping off their bags, the couple went down to a restaurant right by the ocean. They were having a bite to eat, just sitting there listening to the waves, and they were probably thinking to themselves, this is it. This is going to be the best vacation ever. During the first week of their trip, the couple was very active. They were full of energy and wanted to see everything. They spent their days exploring the island, going out on different excursions like boat trips and hiking. They tried lots of different local restaurants. They were just all over the place, soaking in every moment of their honeymoon. And so, come Tuesday, August 16th, which marked the start of their second and final week, the couple was feeling a little bit tired from all that activity. They decided that today they would just have a lazy, relaxing day at the beach. No plans, no schedule, just sun and sand. So that morning, the couple grabbed their swimsuits, their towels, and a couple of beach chairs. They left the resort and headed down to the beach that was right outside their door. After finding a decent spot on the sand, they set up their chairs and towels and put their things down. Gemma laid down on one of the chairs to begin sunbathing, just ready to relax and read a book. Ian, on the other hand, was excited to get in the water. He grabbed his fins and his snorkel, leaned over and kissed Gemma on the cheek, and said he was going to go for a swim. Gemma remembers watching Ian as he walked across the beach toward the water. She watched as he stopped right at the edge of the waves and started to put on his big flippers and adjust his snorkel mask. She remembers just smiling to herself as he did that classic awkward flipper walk into the water. It was a funny, endearing sight. And as she watched him wade out into the ocean, she just thought to herself how incredibly lucky she was to be married to such an amazing guy. She really, truly loved him so much. After Ian had finally gotten into the water and had begun his snorkeling journey exploring the clear waters, Gemma laid back in her chair. The sun was warm, the sound of the gentle waves was soothing, and she began to doze off to sleep. A little while later, though, Gemma suddenly woke up. She was startled by a sound. It almost sounded like someone sneezing, but really, really loudly. It was a sharp, strange noise that cut through the peaceful atmosphere of the beach. Instinctively, she sat up and scanned the waterline, looking for her husband. But all she saw were other tourists in the water, swimming and snorkeling and just having a good time. She couldn't see Ian anywhere among them. And then she heard it. A male voice was calling out for help. It was coming from off to her right, towards the top of the beach, but pretty far away from her. She turned, her heart starting to pound, and she saw him. It was Ian. He was about 60 feet away from the sand, so he was well out into the water. He appeared to be kind of hunched forward, with one of his arms sort of submerged in the water, and he was waving his other arm frantically in the air. It looked like he was stuck on something, maybe caught on some rocks. But before Gemma could even get up or process what to do, before she could run to him or call for help, Ian just began to scream. It was a scream of pure agony and terror, a sound that no one on that beach would ever forget. When Ian began screaming, there was a surgeon who happened to be on vacation at this same beach. He was in a small boat nearby where Ian was. He heard the terrible screams and immediately motored his boat over to Ian. The surgeon and another man who was in the boat with him managed to pull Ian out of the water. They got him onto the boat, and Ian was alive, he was conscious, but the sight was horrific. He was missing his entire left arm. He was missing the majority of his left thigh. And there was a huge chunk of his midsection that was just gone. It would turn out that Ian had been attacked by a bull shark, one of the most aggressive and dangerous shark species in the world. That strange, loud sneezing sound that Gemma had heard, the sound that had startled her awake, was the sound Ian had made through his snorkel at the exact moment the shark first bit down on him. The surgeon rushed Ian to the shore. He pulled him out of the boat and got him onto the sand and immediately began trying to save his life, applying pressure to the catastrophic wounds. At the same time, Gemma had come running up the beach. She managed to push her way through the crowd that was quickly forming around her husband. She dropped down to her knees on the sand right next to him. Ian, at this point, was still alive and he was still conscious. He was very, very badly hurt, but he was looking up and he was clearly making eye contact with Gemma. And Gemma, she was looking down at her husband, making clear eye contact right back with him. They didn't really say much. It was like this horrible, surreal moment where all they could do was just be there, together, in the final seconds of his life. And so, during this kind of silent, heartbreaking acknowledgement of their love and their tragic fate, Ian would ultimately pass away right there on the beach with his wife by his side. It would later turn out that over the past few weeks, there had been a rash of shark attacks at this very beach, including one other fatal attack on another tourist. Shark attacks in Seychelles were so incredibly rare, so unheard of, that authorities believed this had to be the work of one single rogue bull shark. They believed it was one shark that was responsible for all of these attacks. And because this shark had not yet been captured or killed, the country had actually instituted a temporary ban on swimming at this beach and a few other nearby beaches. But for whatever reason, the ban had not been communicated effectively to the tourists. The resorts hadn't made it clear. There were no prominent signs. And so, the ban was not being enforced. Gemma and Ian had absolutely no idea that the water was a dangerous place to be. They had just looked out, saw all the other tourists swimming and splashing around, and believed it was totally safe. When in reality, it obviously wasn't. Gemma would quickly return to England, her honeymoon and her life shattered. She would host her husband's funeral in the exact same church where she and he had been married, so full of hope and happiness just 10 days earlier. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee. It was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who travels to New York City. The film was a massive hit. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. After seeing the movie, with its stunning landscapes and charismatic hero, Ginger felt deeply inspired. She wanted to actually go to Australia to see the incredible country for herself because it just looked so amazing on the big screen. So, a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, traveling all by herself, hopped on a plane and flew to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. Her plan was simple and adventurous. She would land in Australia, work various odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. Then, at some point, whenever she felt like she was tired of doing that, she would just head back to the United States. She was young, independent, and ready for an adventure. She landed in Perth, and right away she saw her first opportunity to make some money. There had been a huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there. As a result, she saw all these beautiful luxury yachts anchored at the docks all along the coastline. Ginger thought to herself, you know, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who was very friendly and outgoing and not afraid to take a chance, went right down to one of these docks. She stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot vessel. She walked right up and introduced herself to the captain of the boat. She said, hey, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going? And in exchange, I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you need. As it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to help their chef in the galley. So he looked at her and said, "Okay, well, can you cook?" And Ginger confidently said, "Yeah, I'm a great cook." And he said, "Okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant." And just like that, Ginger's Australian adventure took an unexpected turn. She climbed on board and met the rest of the 5 other crew members. This included the head chef she'd be working with, a woman named Jane. The 2 of them would become very close friends during their time on the yacht. Shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next major stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly a 14-day journey away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were running dangerously low on fresh water. This was a serious problem in the middle of the ocean. So he decided to take a detour. He turned the yacht east and headed inland, navigating along a river system that he knew would eventually bring them to a large freshwater pool. He also knew that this pool had a huge, beautiful waterfall that dumped down into it. So he figured they could just take the yacht's small boat, go right underneath this waterfall, and fill up their jugs with all the fresh water they needed. Then they could head back out to the open sea, and they'd be good to go. So, on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the massive yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system. Then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which is a much smaller, more agile boat, into the water. Once that was ready, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew all hopped into this dinghy along with a bunch of large, empty water jugs. They began making their way from the ocean into the river. They traveled up this river for a little while, surrounded by the rugged Australian wilderness. And then, finally, they arrived at this huge freshwater pool. Right in front of them was the amazing waterfall the captain had described. Everybody was just totally awestruck by the sight of it. It was like a hidden gem in the middle of nowhere. They were in a very remote, very rugged part of Australia at this point, and to see something so beautiful was breathtaking. The captain brought the dinghy right up near the base of the waterfall. One by one, they held up their empty water jugs and filled them with the cool, fresh water. Once all the jugs were full, they were about to turn around and go back out to sea to get back on their yacht. But then the captain had an idea. He thought to himself, "You know what? We've been at sea for 7 days straight. It's been very monotonous, just the same routine day in and day out. Maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer. Maybe we could even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view, just enjoy the scenery for a bit before we head back out to sea." So he said to his crew, "Hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall?" And everyone agreed it was a great idea. It sounded like a fun little adventure. Everyone, that is, with the exception of Jane. She just didn't feel like hiking to the top of a waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool was basically surrounded on all sides by sheer cliff faces. There really wasn't any place to land the dinghy. There were no flat surfaces, no beach, nothing. You basically had cliffs that went directly into the water, and then you had the river that fed back out to the ocean. So the captain maneuvered the dinghy right up against the cliff face, right next to the waterfall. He, Ginger, and the other crew members, not including Jane, carefully climbed out of the dinghy and onto this cliff face. They began climbing, literally climbing up this steep rock wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it, except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the wet rocks. It was very steep, and it seemed kind of dangerous, and she wasn't an experienced climber. So at some point, she abandoned the idea and carefully made her way back down to the dinghy to wait with Jane. The captain and the rest of the crew, they continued their climb up towards the top. So as Ginger and Jane were sitting there in the dinghy, watching the other crew members making their way up the cliff, they started feeling a little bit left out. They were like, "You know what? Let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall, an easier way." So they began scanning out across the pool, looking at the other cliffs that surrounded it. It looked like on the very other side of the pool, there was a less severe cliff face, one that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. So the two women, in a spontaneous decision, jumped into the murky brown water. They began swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. When they made it about a third of the way across, Jane suddenly stopped swimming. Ginger noticed and turned around in the water and looked at Jane. She was like, "What's going on?" And Jane would tell her, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger was so close to her goal. She was like, "Come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall." So Jane, she was totally hesitant, but she didn't want to let her friend down. She said, "Okay, fine." And they both continued to swim. And then all of a sudden, they heard their captain, who was now at the very top of the waterfall, screaming down to them. He was yelling to get out of the water right now. And they noticed he was pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. So they're looking up at him, confused, and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at. And that's when they saw it. There was this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It was a 12-foot-long saltwater crocodile that had noticed them in the water, and it was charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were way too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim back to it before this crocodile was going to reach them. So their next best choice was just to turn and swim as fast as they could towards the nearest cliff face. Because again, there was no place to get out of the water. There were only cliffs. So they swam frantically towards this cliff face, which was right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall. Water from the falls was landing on them as they reached the rocks. They were trying to climb up, trying to pull themselves out of the water, but there was nowhere to grab onto. The rock face was all totally slick with moss and water. There were no good handholds. All they had was this little ledge that was just under the water's surface that they could stand on, but they were still halfway in the water. After they struggled for a minute, desperately trying to pull themselves out of the water, and they realized they couldn't do it, they both just turned around. They locked arms, standing on that ledge together, and they looked out through the curtain of water that was falling down in front of them, out into the pool. And they saw this crocodile had followed them. It had now stopped, right on the other side of the falling water, and it was just staring at them with its mouth wide open, showing rows of sharp teeth. The two women are looking at it, frozen in terror. They don't know what to do. The captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down the cliff as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them. But it's going to take several minutes at least before they can get down to the dinghy and get over to them. Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this. They're alone. And they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away. At some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface of the murky water. But now, they don't know where it is. This uncertainty, this hidden threat, causes Ginger to completely panic. She let go of Jane's arm, and she dove into the water, off to the right. She was attempting to swim away from where the crocodile had been, trying to make a break for the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes. The crocodile suddenly re-emerged from directly underneath her. It grabbed her by the waist in its powerful jaws and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there on the ledge, watching all of this happen right in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy yet, so she's totally stranded. And she's just staring at the area of water where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. Just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile reemerges. Its head is pointed towards Jane. And in its jaws is Ginger. Ginger's got her arms up over her head. Her eyes are wide with terror, and she's looking right at Jane. Jane makes eye contact with her friend for one last horrific moment. But there was nothing she could do. She just watched as Ginger was again pulled back under the water. And this time, she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would finally get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, and they would pick her up. About 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would later turn out that the captain was well aware of the threat that crocodiles posed in this river. He had told his entire crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat. He had explicitly warned them that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, in a moment of carefree adventure, his warning went unheeded. In 2017, a man named Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit. From the time he was just a little kid, he had this sort of restless energy about him. He always needed to be out doing stuff. He could never just sit still. And so, by the time he was old enough, he left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon. There, he moved into a commune. A commune is a community of people that live together and share all their possessions and responsibilities. But shortly after moving into this commune, Aaron got restless again. This wasn't enough for him. And so he left the commune and began traveling all over the United States. But after he had basically gone everywhere in the country, seen all the sights, he became restless again. So he left the United States entirely. He went to Nepal and began traveling all over that country. And while he was there, he met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina. The two fell madly in love. And then, when it was time for Ladina to leave Nepal and go back to her home country, Aaron followed her. He moved to Switzerland to be with her. Just a couple of years later, in 2014, the pair got married. They bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. For a time, Aaron and Ladina were very happy. Their life was very simple and straightforward. They loved each other, and they loved living in Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust, that deep-seated need to explore, reared its head again. He went up to Ladina and he told her, honey, I need to go out and explore again. I need to go out and be free again. Even if it's just for a couple of days or a week or whatever time it is, I need it. He explained that he needed it in order to feel sane. I don't think Ladina was very pleased about this development. It's hard to hear that the person you love needs to leave to feel free. However, she knew her husband. She knew this was a core part of who he was, and she knew it was important to him and to his mental health. So she said, okay, honey, you do what you have to do. So Aaron thought about what he was going to do to satisfy this deep desire to go out and be free again. He settled on attending that year's Burning Man festival. It was something he had never done before, and it seemed like the ultimate expression of the freedom and community he was searching for. So Aaron left Switzerland and he went back to Oregon in the United States. He met up with a very close friend of his named Justin. Justin was actually someone he had lived with in the commune all those years ago. So the two of them, they linked up in Oregon, and from there, they drove in Justin's big van out to the Nevada desert. When they got to Nevada, they drove out to the Burning Man site. As they were pulling up, they saw thousands and thousands of other vans and tents and all these people out in the middle of the desert setting up and building this temporary community, this utopia. So right away, Aaron and Justin, they found their spot. They parked their van and they began to build their own campsite. And then after that, they pulled their bikes out of the van and began biking around, helping other people build their sites and build the rest of the community. So by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had already made lots of new friends. They were out partying and dancing and singing with total strangers, just completely immersed in the Burning Man experience. That night, Aaron would actually turn in early, while Justin would stay up and continue having a good time with the new people he had met. Aaron was just not a night owl. He liked to get a full night's sleep and then get up early in the morning, make himself a smoothie, and do yoga. This was very normal behavior for him. Justin would later say that he really looked up to Aaron. In fact, many people who knew Aaron looked up to him. Because Aaron, on the one hand, was a total free spirit that would just kind of go where the wind would blow him. But at the same time, he was very regimented and disciplined. He took great care of himself, both physically and mentally. He just seemed wise beyond his years. And he was incredibly charismatic and very funny, so people really flocked to him and really idolized him. One of the central traditions of Burning Man has to do with its namesake. Towards the end of every festival, they build this 40-foot tall wooden effigy of a man, and they burn it to the ground. Hence the name, Burning Man. So on the night of the so-called man burn, Aaron told Justin that he was not going to turn in early that night. He said that instead, he was going to stay up and watch the spectacle of this effigy being burned to the ground. Justin was really excited about it, and so was Aaron. So that evening, Aaron and Justin met up with the new friends they had made while they were at Burning Man, and their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. Now, this huge structure was situated in a huge open clearing. And standing all around this wooden man were what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event who also have some fire training. They would stand almost shoulder to shoulder or very close to shoulder, facing away from the effigy, forming a human perimeter around it. The rangers' job was to prevent the crowd of 70,000 people from getting too close to the effigy when it was on fire, because it's obviously a huge hazard. So Aaron, Justin, and their friends, when they got to this clearing and saw the effigy, they would have seen thousands and thousands of event attendees converging on this thing, getting as close to the rangers as they possibly could on all sides. So Aaron and Justin and their friends, they made their way up to one particular section of this massive crowd, and they began fighting their way through all these people, trying to get as close to the rangers as they possibly could, because they wanted a good view of the man burn. And then, once they were satisfied with their view, they just stopped and waited for the effigy to be lit. But just before the effigy was lit, Aaron turned to Justin and said, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, on the other side of the crowd. I'm going to go see them right now." Justin was totally bummed that Aaron was going to be leaving right before this thing was lit because he wanted to experience this moment with Aaron. But he said, "Okay, no problem. I'll see you. Hopefully, before this thing gets lit, or, I'll see you after this burn is done." And so Aaron departed from the group, and Justin watched as he kind of just disappeared into the dense crowd. Then Justin turned his attention back towards the effigy. A little while later, when the sun had gone down and it was totally dark out and the crowd was totally electric as they were waiting for this thing to light, finally they did. They lit the effigy. And as soon as it went up in flames, the crowd of thousands and thousands of people roared with excitement. This whole time, Justin is totally amazed by what he is watching, but he's also scanning the crowd, hoping that Aaron will eventually pop back up. But at this point, the crowd is so massive and everyone's so tightly packed together that Justin isn't really expecting Aaron to be able to make his way back over to where he had been. It just didn't seem possible. So this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames and everyone's so amazed by it. And then, eventually, the flames begin to dwindle down as the structure continues to burn, getting lower and lower to the ground. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begins to disperse. At this point, Justin again looks around, hoping to maybe see Aaron, but, Aaron has not come back yet. And so Justin just says, "Okay, maybe it's time to leave and go check in with Aaron back at the van." So he notifies his friends that he's going to turn around and head back. And as Justin turns and begins leaving the crowd, someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin, and they frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that had happened to Aaron. Now, at first, Justin just could not believe it. He couldn't even process it. It seemed so outlandish and so unbelievable that it just could not have possibly happened. But then he was thinking to himself, I haven't seen Aaron since he left to go see his friends from Switzerland, and I have no idea where he is. And so Justin starts looking around the crowd again. He's not seeing Aaron, and he's starting to panic. And so finally, Justin just turns and starts running back towards his van in the desperate hope that Aaron is going to be there. But when he gets back to his van, Aaron is not there, and there's no sign that Aaron has been back since they had left for the man burn. It would turn out that that shocking story Justin had been told about Aaron was true. This is what really happened. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd and spend some time with his friends from Switzerland, he disappeared from the group. He made his way over to that far side of the crowd, but we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland or if that was just some cover story to get away from Justin and the other people he was with. But regardless, at some point, Aaron made his way over to the other side of the effigy, away from Justin and away from his other friends. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd until he was right in front of the Rangers with front row seats of the effigy. And then, after the effigy was set alight and was fully engulfed in flames, Aaron at some point bum rushed one of the Rangers who was standing right in front of him. He was able to push past him. And then, before that Ranger or any other nearby Rangers could stop him, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive, burning effigy. He ran right into the fire, and he disappeared inside of it. Because the crowd was massive and unruly, and many people were under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both, because of all that, even though Aaron ran into a blazing fire right in front of them, it was like nobody noticed. Everybody was in their own little world. It was dark out, there was this giant fire, there were so many distractions that really nobody noticed this happening besides the Rangers that were immediately affected by Aaron running past them, and some of the people that were right at the front of the crowd who watched as Aaron did this. And so this is why Justin and the rest of his friends had no idea this had happened, despite the fact they were watching this same fire as it was happening. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the Rangers were able to go in after him and pull him out. But by that time, it was already too late. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night from his injuries. It would later be determined that Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the burning man. This means he was of a clear mind when he decided to do this. And so it was determined that his death had to be a suicide. However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit suicide, especially like this. It just didn't make any sense. This is not something Aaron would have done. He was acting totally normally. His behavior was not erratic. Something else must have caused this to happen. But unfortunately, at this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so, to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Michael DiPolito grew up in a place that was tough by any standard. We're talking about a rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia. This was the kind of place where things like violence, drugs, and prostitution weren't shocking events you saw on the news. They were just part of the background noise of everyday life. And like a lot of kids in that environment, Michael got pulled into it early. His parents were alcoholics, and soon so was he. It didn't stop there. He developed a serious drug addiction, and to pay for it, he started selling drugs himself. School just wasn't a priority for him. He eventually dropped out of high school, and it wasn't long after that he found himself with nowhere to go. He became homeless, living out on the streets of the city he grew up in. At night, he'd find abandoned buildings to sleep in, just trying to stay warm and get through to the next day. In 1993, while he was still in this situation in South Philadelphia, the law caught up with him for the first time. He was arrested and charged with possession of an unknown drug, as well as the intent to sell it. The court records don't say what the drug was, but it didn't really matter. Michael was given a court date, and he just didn't show up. A warrant was put out for his arrest. Somehow, Michael managed to stay off the radar. He evaded the police for years. By 1997, he decided he needed a complete change of scenery. He fled South Philly and made his way down to South Florida, landing in a town called Boca Raton. But his old life had a way of following him. Shortly after he arrived, he was arrested for a second time. This time, he had offered an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution, but he was released not long after. A year after that arrest, his past came knocking again. A former girlfriend named Karen Tan sued him. She claimed he was the father of her son and that he owed her child support. Karen wasn't just making it up, she had a DNA test to prove it. But, just like with his drug charge, Michael simply didn't show up for court. After a while, Karen must have realized it was a losing battle, and she gave up and dropped the lawsuit. For Michael, this was probably a huge relief. At the time, he was working through a temp agency, making barely any money. He knew he couldn't afford child support. So after that lawsuit was dropped, Michael decided he needed to find a way to make some real money. And in his search for a better opportunity, he somehow crossed paths with associates of the Bonanno crime family. Now, the Bonanno family is one of the 5 infamous families that dominate organized crime in the United States. They are, quite literally, the Italian mafia. When they met Michael, they saw something in him. He was charismatic, a natural talker. They liked him. And they offered him a job, an illegal one, but a very lucrative one. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room isn't a literal room with a boiler. It's a place where a group of fraudsters work the phones using high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from people. The way it usually works is a fraudster will cold call someone, maybe an elderly person, and tell them about this incredible get-rich-quick investment opportunity. But they'd always say, you have to invest right now, or you'll miss out. When the unsuspecting victim agrees and wires over their money, the fraudster just keeps it. Michael turned out to be incredibly good at this. He was a natural salesman, and he could trick people into giving him their money with ease. And so, it didn't take long for him to realize he could make a lot more if he wasn't just an employee. He wanted to be the boss. He figured if he started his own boiler room, his commission on the money he stole could be much, much higher. So, pretty abruptly, he left the mafia's operation. We don't really know how the Bonanno family reacted to one of their guys just up and leaving to start a competing scam. Michael went on to set up not 1, but 2 of his own boiler room scams right there in South Florida. By 2002, he had managed to steal $155,000, but he had spent almost all of it. He lived a lavish lifestyle of fancy hotels, expensive cars, and phone sex lines. The good times, however, were not going to last. In 2002, the police finally caught on to Michael's scams. They raided both of his boiler rooms, and Michael was arrested for a 3rd time. And this time, he didn't skip his court date. He stood trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and an incredible 28 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay back every single cent of the $155,000 he had stolen. Michael would only end up serving 7 months of his 2-year sentence, but those 7 months changed him forever. He absolutely hated prison. He hated every single second of it. During the long, sleepless nights he spent lying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself. He swore that when he got out, when he was finally released, he would never, ever come back. And so, when he was released in 2003, he was a man on a mission. The first thing he did was enter a sobriety program. He started going to the gym every single morning, getting his body and mind right. He also started studying for his GED. That's a high school equivalency test because remember, he had never gotten his high school diploma. A couple of months later, he passed the test and earned his GED. Then, he started a legitimate business. It was a digital marketing firm he called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael did his absolute best to stay on the straight and narrow. He focused on his sobriety, his health, and his business. And for the most part, he succeeded. By 2008, he was still sober, though he'd had a few setbacks along the way. His business, Mad Money Inc., was doing very well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his personal life was about to get very messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend, Maria Luongo. Maria had stood by him through everything, including his time in jail. But that year, in 2008, Michael, who was now 38 years old, cheated on her. He met a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Muhammad at a Starbucks. What was probably intended to be a quick, meaningless fling turned into something more. Michael and Dalia fell in love, and they fell hard. Once Michael knew his feelings were real, he went to his wife Maria and told her everything. He told her he was in love with someone else and he wanted a divorce. Just 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Michael and Dalia went down to the courthouse and got married. The newlyweds moved into a brand new condo that Michael had bought for them in Boynton Beach, a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a little while, their life seemed perfect. They knew the way they got together was outrageous, meeting and marrying so quickly, but they didn't care. They got along great and were excited to start their future together. But that perfect life was not going to last. On the evening of the 12th of March 2009, only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dalia were at home in their condo. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the front door. Michael went to see who it was. He opened the door, and to his complete surprise, his probation officer was standing on his doorstep. And behind the probation officer was a whole group of police officers. Before Michael could even ask what was going on, his probation officer told him that they had received an anonymous phone call. The caller had tipped them off that Michael was selling steroids, ecstasy pills, and other drugs out of his condo. Michael was stunned. He told the probation officer there was no way that was true. He insisted he wasn't selling any drugs. He was sober. He wasn't involved in that life anymore. Eventually, seeing that they were serious, Michael just stepped aside. He said, "Please, come in. Search my condo. I have nothing to hide." So, that's what they did. The police came inside and searched the entire place. But just as Michael had said, they didn't find anything. And so, they left. After the police were gone, Michael and Dalia just stood there in their condo, completely dumbfounded. What just happened? Who would make a call like that? But instead of trying to figure it all out right then and there, they decided the best thing to do was just to get out of the condo for the night. They packed a couple of bags, left their home, which was a total mess from the police search, and went to stay at a nice hotel. They tried to put the strange event behind them and just have a nice night together. The next morning, they got up and headed down to the hotel parking lot. As they were walking toward their car, they saw a familiar sight. Standing around Michael's car was his probation officer, along with several other police officers. Michael and Dalia looked at each other in disbelief. What is going on? They rushed over to the car, and before they could even start pleading their innocence, Michael's probation officer held up a hand. He told Michael that they had received another anonymous call. This time, the caller said that Michael was selling drugs out of his vehicle, and they needed to search it. Michael was just beside himself. He couldn't believe this was happening again. But what could he do? He told them to go ahead and search the car. He said there was nothing in there. And so, the police opened up his car and tore it apart, looking for anything illegal. And once again, they found nothing. Over the next couple of weeks, this was the only thing Michael and Dalia could talk about. Who was making these anonymous calls? Why was someone claiming Michael was selling drugs from his condo and his car? It just didn't make any sense. They wanted to believe it was all just some big, crazy mistake, but in the back of their minds, they both knew about Michael's very checkered past. They thought about his dealings with the mafia and all the people he had ripped off in his boiler room scams. They started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone from his past was looking for revenge, trying to get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th. This was 17 days after that first raid on their condo. That night, Michael and Dahlia had been out to dinner at a restaurant. When they left and walked out to the parking lot, they were met with the same unbelievable scene. Standing around Michael's car were several police officers, clearly waiting for him. This time, they didn't even need to ask why the police were there. Michael and Dahlia walked over to them and just started pleading. They told the officers that this had to be a setup. They insisted they didn't have any drugs in the car. They begged the police to understand that someone was doing this to them. But this time, when the police searched his car, they would find something. After a thorough search of Michael's car, the police found a small bag of cocaine. It was stuck inside of a cigarette carton, which was tucked away underneath the spare tire in the trunk. When Michael saw the officer pull the bag of cocaine out, he just broke down. He started to cry. He knew, even though the drugs were not his, and even though he hadn't put them there, that he was going to jail. He was on probation. A possession charge would be a clear violation, and he would be sent right back to prison. He just stood there crying, pleading with the police, swearing that the cocaine was not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia was watching all of this unfold. And for a moment, she started to second-guess everything. Was Michael lying? Was he actually selling drugs and had been lying to her this whole time? But then she looked at her husband. He was crying hysterically, and he looked so sincere, so genuinely terrified. And in that moment, she decided she believed him. She was convinced he had to be telling the truth. So pretty soon, she was standing right there beside Michael, also pleading with the police. She told them to let him go, that this was obviously a setup. Amazingly, the police officers seemed to be listening. They were already aware of the two previous false tip-offs about Michael. They told Michael and Dahlia that they did think the situation was pretty suspicious. Someone keeps calling in about you selling drugs, and now, suddenly, drugs magically appear in your car. It seemed too convenient. So, the officers told them what they were going to do. They said they were going to confiscate the cocaine, but they were not going to arrest Michael. They told them to go home, be safe, and to call them immediately if they saw or heard anything strange. And they promised they would start an investigation to figure out who was making all of these anonymous calls. Michael and Dahlia were so relieved they could hardly believe it. But at the same time, they were also terrified. It was clear now that whoever was trying to get Michael in trouble was willing to break into his property to do it. What was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs there too? After the police left, Michael and Dahlia jumped in their car and sped back to their condo. They went inside and searched the entire place from top to bottom. They were looking for any sign that someone had recently been inside, or for any more drugs or anything else illegal that might have been planted. After a long search, they found nothing. So they locked all their doors, shut all their windows, closed all the blinds, and just prayed. They prayed that the police would be able to quickly find out who was doing this to them and make it stop. But over the next few months, the police didn't figure out who the anonymous caller was. And that was because the caller had stopped calling. The phone calls just ended. And for a little while, Michael and Dahlia started to believe that the whole terrifying ordeal was finally over. They slowly returned to their normal lives. But on the 5th of August 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine had been found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning, at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo. Michael was still in bed, asleep. She headed out to her local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 inches the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and checked her phone. She saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. The number had also left her a voicemail. So she called her voicemail and put the phone to her ear. As she listened to the message, her heart started to race. It was a Boynton Beach detective. He was telling her that there had been some sort of incident at her condo and that she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and ran out of the gym. She got into her car and immediately called the number back. When the detective picked up, she tried to get more information out of him. What kind of incident? What happened? But the detective would only say that it involved her husband, Michael, and that he would explain everything when she got back to the condo. In a total state of shock, Dahlia started her car, sped out of the parking lot, and headed home. When she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she slammed on the brakes. The entire area was a chaotic scene. In front of her condo were multiple police cars, their lights flashing. Police officers were walking all around the property. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front of her home. And inside that taped-off area, there were crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. As Dahlia sat there in her car at the end of the street, just staring at this unbelievable scene, one of the Boynton Beach police officers saw her. He walked up to her car, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he told her to leave her car right where it was and to come with him. Dahlia knew, obviously, that something terrible had happened, but she still didn't know exactly what. She put her car in park, got out, and began walking with the police officer. He led her toward a small group of 3 people who were standing right in front of her property. It turned out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. As soon as that detective saw Dahlia approaching, he walked over to her. And then, very matter-of-factly, he told her that someone had called in a disturbance at their condo. He said that shots were fired, and unfortunately, her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia became totally hysterical. An officer gently led her away from the scene and into a nearby police car. They drove her to the police station, sat her down in an interrogation room, and began asking her questions about her husband. The detective said to her, "Look, I know you just found this out, but we have to figure out what happened. There's a killer on the loose, and we need to find this person and stop them." At first, the conversation was mostly just Dahlia crying while the detective tried to calm her down. But eventually, she started talking. She told the detective all about the anonymous caller who kept phoning the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs. She told him how she and Michael suspected that the caller was probably connected to someone from his past. Maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims from his boiler room scams. She said it could be any number of people that Michael had wronged over the years. The detective took diligent notes, listening patiently to everything Dahlia said. Then, during a break in the conversation, he looked at her and said, "Okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy." Dahlia, who had been looking down at the table, looked up, confused about what he was talking about, and then the door to the interrogation room opened. A huge man in handcuffs walked into the room. An officer was yelling, "Come here! Bring this guy in here!" "Get over here." "Do you know who this guy is?" Dahlia looked at the man and said, "Never seen him before." The officer asked the man, "Do you know her?" The man looked at Dahlia. An officer said, "Put your head up and look at her." The man said, "I've never seen her before." The officer then asked him, "What were you doing coming out of her house?" Then he ordered for the man to be taken out of the room. It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She knew exactly who that man was. The truth was, almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted the rest of his money, and she wanted his condo too. So, she had been the anonymous caller all along. She was the one who kept calling the police, tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the bag of cocaine in the back of his car. She wanted him to get arrested because she knew that since he was on probation, he would go back to jail for a really long time and she would get everything. But when her efforts failed and Michael didn't get arrested and sent back to jail, Dahlia moved on to Plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and asked him a chilling question. She asked him if he knew any hitmen that could murder her husband. At first, the ex-boyfriend didn't think she was serious, but she kept asking him about it. She started offering to pay for it. She was making it very clear that she wasn't joking around. So the ex-boyfriend basically told her no, he didn't know any hitmen. And then he hung up the phone and called the Boynton Beach Police Department. He told them everything about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill her husband, Michael. When the police found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman. They set up a meeting with Dahlia. That undercover agent was the huge guy in handcuffs who was just led into the interrogation room with her. Dahlia had gone to meet this fake hitman. She got into his car, and there was a hidden camera in the back seat filming her the entire time. She was caught on camera saying she wanted to kill her husband. She gave money to the undercover agent as a down payment. Then, just as she was about to get out of the car, the agent turned to her. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave this car, it's done. I am going to kill Michael, and you can't stop it." Dahlia's reaction was captured on film. She said, "It's not changing. No. There's no, positive, 5,000% sure." She went on to say, "No, when I say I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna do it. As soon as he told me about getting the money from you, I went and I grabbed it right away. We were good to go. With me, you're not gonna have a problem. You're not gonna have an issue." So, the Boynton Beach Police Department now had all this information. They knew exactly what Dahlia thought was going to happen. And they decided they could use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And as it just so happened, the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area at that time. So the police department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. They got to film everything. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. She headed to the gym, believing in her mind that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after she left. She thought he would break in and shoot her husband twice in the head because that was the plan they had agreed on, the plan that was captured on film. As soon as the police who were monitoring the condo saw her leave, they rushed in. They knocked on the door and got Michael to come downstairs. Michael had absolutely no idea that his wife was trying to have him killed. He came to the door, totally confused, but he went with the officers. They ushered him off to the police station for his safety. Then, for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right in front of the condo. Once everything was in place, that's when the detective called Dahlia and left her that voicemail saying there had been an incident and she needed to come back. A couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called him back and said she was on her way, that's when the TV crews for the Cops show set up their cameras in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next. The detective's words to her were recorded. "Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house and there were shots fired." Dahlia asked, "Is your husband Michael okay?" And the detective delivered the line, "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed." Back in the interrogation room, after the fake hitman was pulled out and Dahlia had denied knowing him, the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news. He told her he knew all about her murder-for-hire plot and that she was going to jail. He told her, "You're under arrest." That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in front of CBS. She started to deny it, saying, "I didn't do anything." The detective cut her off. "You're going to jail." Don't tell me you didn't do anything. You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail. We're going to book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive. Dahlia's response was a disbelieving, "Oh, yes." Thank God. The detective continued, "Thank God. He doesn't want to see you." After Dahlia was arrested, while she was still sitting in that interrogation room, the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking her husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Her reaction was caught on tape. "Oh my God, he's alive! Come here, please. Come here, please. Come here. Come here, please. Come here." "Why not?" "I heard you, Mike. Come here, please. Come here." Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done. But after a retrial, which was granted because of jury bias in her first trial, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the evening of the 28th of April 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs was sitting on the couch in her mother-in-law's house in the small, quiet city of Pascagoula, Ohio. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, a nervous energy building inside of her. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was happily playing with a little stuffed animal, completely unaware of her mother's anxiety. It was 6:30 in the evening, and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was scheduled to call any minute. But he wasn't calling from work or from a friend's house. Dave was calling from the county jail, where he was currently incarcerated. He had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars, not for anything violent, but for something that to Rhonda felt just as damaging to their family. He had failed to pay child support to one of his ex-girlfriends. And while Rhonda was deeply upset and embarrassed by the whole situation, a part of her knew she really shouldn't have been surprised. This was just who Dave was. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, she had been completely swept away by his carefree, rebellious personality. He was the lead singer in a local rock band, and she had fallen in love with him while watching him on stage, dancing in the front row at his shows. Back then, it all felt so glamorous and exciting, like a fantasy. It felt like they were going to stay young and wild forever. But now, reality had set in hard. They were both 38 years old, they had a toddler to raise, and a mountain of bills to pay. But Dave, it seemed, just kept on partying and playing the part of a rock star, while all the real-world responsibilities fell squarely on Rhonda's shoulders. She could barely remember the last time she'd gone to one of his shows since Amanda was born. In part, it was because a smoky, loud bar was no place for a baby. But it was also because the crowd Dave hung around with was not the kind of crowd she wanted to be a part of anymore. They were hard drinkers, some were into drugs, and more than a few were ex-convicts. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave not as carefree, but as just plain reckless. The phone on the end table finally rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Rhonda picked it up. As she expected, it was Dave on the other end. What she really wanted to say, what was bubbling up inside her, was that she was angry, that she was tired, and that she was seriously considering filing for divorce. In fact, she had already taken a major step. She'd gone through her paperwork and quietly taken his name off of her retirement plan. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt significant. It was her preparing for a future without him. But she couldn't say any of that right now. She could see her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, pretending to be busy, but clearly listening in on the conversation. And so, instead of saying what she really felt, Rhonda just put on a brave face and said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, Rhonda was back at her own home. She placed a casserole into the oven to heat up for dinner. Then, she turned on the cartoons for Amanda to keep her occupied and went outside. It was getting dark, but she was determined to mow the lawn. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house by herself. Dave was practically never home anyway, between his band practice and his nights out with friends. But now that he was actually in jail, she had to do literally everything. That included wrestling with their old, unreliable lawnmower on a Sunday night. She wheeled the machine out of the garage and into the yard and gave the cord a hard pull to start the engine. The mower sputtered to life for a moment, then died. She tried again. It roared for a few seconds, then cut out again. As she was struggling with it, she noticed her neighbor coming out of his house across the street. He gave her a friendly wave as he walked down his driveway. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted for her to turn off the mower. Once she did, and the yard was quiet again, he called out, asking if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower, which he assured her actually worked. Rhonda looked around at the tall grass, then at the sky, which was getting darker by the minute. She glanced at her watch and realized her casserole would be done any second. She really appreciated the offer, but she just didn't have the time or the energy for it anymore. She shouted back that it was okay, she had to go back inside anyway. She said goodbye to her neighbor, pushed the defective lawnmower back into the garage, and made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the next day. She figured maybe he could come by and fix it for her. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex and lived about 45 minutes away, but he'd been a huge help to Rhonda while Dave was in jail. Just last week, he had come over and fixed her washing machine. He was always calling to check in on her and Amanda, and she was grateful for his help. Back inside, Rhonda went straight to the kitchen and took the casserole out of the oven just as the timer was about to go off. She cut it into 2 pieces, one for her and a smaller one for Amanda, and brought the plates into the dining room. After setting them on the table, she walked over, turned off the television, scooped up her daughter from the living room floor, and carried her over to her high chair. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do was eat quickly, clean up, and go to bed. But dinner with a toddler was never that simple. For every spoonful of food that made it into Amanda's mouth, it seemed another one wound up on the floor. Rhonda knew she was facing another round of cleanup before she could finally get some rest. But she also knew Amanda couldn't help it. She was just a little kid. So Rhonda reached over, took her daughter's fork, and started helping her eat, trying to minimize the mess and speed things up. In moments like these, Rhonda knew that Amanda was the one thing, the only thing, preventing her from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for just a few weeks. She couldn't imagine doing this all by herself forever. And since she already had proof that Dave was bad at paying child support, the very reason he was in jail right now, she figured that even if a judge ordered him to pay her, she'd likely end up having to pay all the bills herself anyway. She would need to work full-time. Rhonda did have a job as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that salary would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any help. But just as she was scooping up another bite of casserole for Amanda, she heard a noise from outside. It sounded like heavy, hurried footsteps. She turned and looked towards the front window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the dark silhouette of a person coming quickly up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, a man named Gary Pulowski was at his desk at Hamilton Home Products, a heating equipment company just outside of Columbus. He noticed that his coworker, Rhonda Boggs, was running late for her shift. This was more than just unusual. It was unheard of. In all the time Rhonda had worked there, she had never once been late. Gary started asking around the office to see if anyone had heard from her, if maybe she had called in sick. But his coworkers all shook their heads. No one had heard from her since she left the office on Friday evening. Gary went back to his desk and tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. He tried a few more times over the next hour, but still got no answer. He waited, hoping she might call back, but the phone on his desk remained silent. A knot of worry began to form in his stomach. He started to think that maybe she'd had car trouble. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pascala to the office, and back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone. He didn't know if Rhonda did. If her car had broken down, she could be stranded on the side of the road with no way to call for help. And so, Gary made a decision. He told his boss he was going to check on her, got in his own car, and started driving the route from the office back towards Rhonda's house, hoping to spot her car on the shoulder. Gary drove the entire way to Pascala, his eyes peeled, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of Rhonda or her car, but he saw nothing. It wasn't until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car. It was parked right in her driveway next to her small, white-paneled one-story house. At that moment, Gary's worry turned into a deep sense of dread. If her car was here, it meant Rhonda had never even left for work. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that if she had stayed home this whole time without calling him or anyone else, something had to be very wrong. He pulled his car up to the curb, got out, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. He knocked, waited, then knocked again, louder this time. There was no answer. He walked around the side of the house to the back door and knocked there too. Still nothing but silence. He walked back around to the front of the house, feeling defeated, unsure of what to do next. He was about to leave and maybe call the police when he saw a flicker of movement in one of the front windows. The drapes were rustling. He squinted, trying to see what was causing it, and then his heart sank. He saw the small face of Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, peering out at him. Her little face was red and splotchy, as if she had been crying for a very long time. Now, Gary started to panic, but he fought to keep his voice calm. He ran over to the window and shouted through the glass, telling Amanda that he was a friend of her mommy's. He tried to convince her to go to the front door and open it so he could come in and help her. It took a minute for the little girl to understand what he was asking, but eventually she seemed to get it. She disappeared from the window. A moment later, Gary heard the faint click of the lock on the front door, and it slowly creaked open. He rushed over and stepped inside. The first thing he saw stopped him cold. There were bloody footprints tracked across the living room carpet. Without a second thought, Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up into his arms, turned around, and ran out of the house. He sprinted across the street, pounded on the neighbor's door, and when they opened it, he yelled at them to call the police immediately. Not long after, officers from the Pascala Police Department arrived. This was the first homicide in their small town in 6 years. The entire police department only had 17 officers, and their crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. Police Chief Chris Forci knew he didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in every available officer and sent them to the crime scene. Then he headed out there himself to make sure everything was done by the book. By the time Forci arrived at the house, his officers had already secured the perimeter with yellow tape. He ducked under the tape, walked inside, and followed the sounds of footsteps and the clicking of cameras into the kitchen. There, on the tile floor, a woman was lying in a large pool of blood. An officer informed Forci that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs. He explained that it was her coworker who had come to check on her that morning and had found her daughter alone in the house, which led to the 911 call. The officer also told him that Rhonda's toddler had been found physically uninjured. Forci knelt down to examine the body. Right away, he could see more than a dozen stab wounds on her head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the amount of blood spatter all over the kitchen told him there had been a violent struggle. It looked like Rhonda had fought back against her attacker, and fought hard. The remnants of a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was still fully dressed. Forci figured the attack must have happened sometime after dinner, but before she had gone to bed. He couldn't help but wonder if her poor little girl had been awake, or maybe even in the room when it happened. After the crime scene photographers had documented everything, Forci gave the coroner's staff the go-ahead to move the body. As they carefully lifted Rhonda's body from the floor and placed it onto a stretcher, Forci noticed something lying on the tile beneath where she had been. It was a steak knife, its blade covered in dried blood. He looked over at the kitchen counter and saw a knife block. The black handle on the murder weapon was a perfect match to the set of knives on the counter. It appeared Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen. This was a significant detail. It meant her killer probably hadn't brought a weapon with them, which suggested this was a spontaneous, heat-of-the-moment crime rather than something that had been meticulously planned out. While his officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forchi walked through the rest of the small house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. In the bedroom, a jewelry box on the dresser was open and empty. The dresser drawers were pulled out, with piles of Rhonda's clothes thrown all over the floor. In the dining room, he found a purse that had been turned upside down, its contents spilled out across the table. It was clear that someone had been frantically searching through it. With the ransacked appearance of the house and the weapon of opportunity, Forchi's initial theory was that this was a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But there was one detail that didn't quite fit. There was no sign of a forced entry anywhere. No broken windows, no pried open doors. Just then, Forchi heard a commotion near the front of the house. He walked over and saw a woman trying to push her way past his officers and into the home. Her face was red, she was sobbing uncontrollably, and she was shouting, demanding to know what had happened. Forchi gently took the woman outside and tried to calm her down. She eventually told him that her name was Kim Davis, and she was Rhonda's sister. Once Kim had caught her breath, Forchi had the difficult task of explaining what he knew so far. He told her that her sister had been found stabbed to death inside the house. He mentioned his running theory that it might have been a robbery, but he also pointed out that the lack of forced entry could mean that Rhonda knew her attacker, that she might have willingly let them into the house. Kim was obviously devastated by this news, and for a minute, Forchi just tried to console her. But he knew he had to press on with the investigation. Once she had calmed down a little, he asked her if she could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. Kim immediately shook her head. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies at all. But after thinking about it for a moment, she said that actually there was one person who had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her own husband, Dave. Kim told the chief that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been falling apart for a while. In fact, Rhonda had recently confided in her that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But then, Kim added that Dave was currently in jail, so she didn't see how he could have possibly done this himself. Still, she thought it was possible that he could have been involved somehow. Maybe he had paid someone to do it, or convinced one of his shady friends to do it for him. Forchi promised Kim he would look into it, but he was already feeling skeptical. If Dave couldn't even afford to pay his child support, what were the chances he could afford to hire a hitman? And the murder weapon, coming from Rhonda's own kitchen, didn't fit with the idea of a planned assassination. At this point, Forchi believed their best chance to figure out what really happened was to speak with the only other known person at the scene of the crime, Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services arrived at the house. Forchi met her outside and explained that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping she could help him. He needed her to try to talk to the little girl and see if she could tell them anything about the murder. The social worker agreed. Forchi took her across the street to the neighbor's house where Amanda had been staying all morning. Forchi knew it was a long shot. The little girl could be in shock, and at 2 years old, her memory and ability to communicate would be limited. He also knew that anything she did say might not be reliable. But he had to try. He stood quietly in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda. She gently asked the little girl what she had seen the night before. To Forchi's astonishment, Amanda looked up at the social worker and jerked her small hand toward her own neck, in a gesture that looked chillingly like a stabbing motion. Then, in a tiny, quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. The social worker then asked her if anyone else had been there. Forchi found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. After a moment of silence, Amanda spoke a single name. She said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forchi was still at the crime scene when a cruiser pulled up. 2 of his officers got out, pulled a grungy-looking man out of the back seat, and escorted him into the house. But this was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was her father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Forchi was absolutely planning to find and speak with this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information about him as he could. Amanda had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt her mommy. But as definitive as a 2-year-old could sound, Forchi knew he needed an adult's perspective before he made any moves. A judge had granted Dave an early release from jail because of the tragedy. Forchi had made sure Dave was brought directly to the crime scene so he could question him before Dave had a chance to talk to anyone else and potentially contaminate his memory. Forchi met Dave and the officers at the door and led them into the living room, sitting Dave down on the couch. They briefly filled him in on what had happened to his wife. But before he could fully process the shock, they told him they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house to help them identify what might have been stolen. But first, Forchi said he had a very important question. He looked at Dave and asked, "Who is Uncle Nick?" At this, Dave, who until that point had just looked completely shell-shocked, now looked confused. He told Forchi that Uncle Nick was the name his daughter used for his second cousin. His real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, but everyone just called him Nick. He explained that Nick had been helping Rhonda out with things around the house while he was in jail. He said Nick had probably been over at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another. But Dave said he couldn't understand why Forchi was asking about him. He insisted there was no way Nick would ever hurt Rhonda. He said Nick really looked out for her and for Amanda. Forchi didn't explain why he was asking. The information was enough. He went outside, got on his police radio, and broadcast a bulletin to all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for a man named Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a patrol car spotted Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala. They pulled him over. The officers ordered him out of the vehicle at gunpoint. As soon as he was out, Venerable bolted to ground, put a gun to the back of his head, and cuffed him. While they were cuffing him, they noticed a dark spot on his baseball cap that looked suspiciously like a bloodstain. As they placed him in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking what was going on, but the officers didn't answer him. Instead, they began to search his SUV. In the back, they found pieces of cardboard laid out, and on the cardboard were reddish-brown smears that also appeared to be blood. When the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick looked at them and asked, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time the arrest was made, Chief Forchi was at Nick Robinson's house, questioning his wife, Debbie. So, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, a man named Bruce Brooks, to go down to the police headquarters and handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the small interview room, he immediately saw that Nick, who was sitting at the table with his head in his hands, looked pale and sick. Brooks asked him if he was okay. Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He laid out his alibi. He said he had been at a bar called Merry Melody in Columbus until around 10:30 the previous night. Then he had driven to another bar in Lancaster, a town near where he lived, called the Fairview Inn. He said he finally got home around 1:30 in the morning and passed out on his couch. Nick swore up and down that he didn't know anything about what had happened to Rhonda and that he only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news that day. As for the blood police found in his SUV and on his hat, he claimed it was just animal blood from a recent hunting trip. But Detective Brooks was not buying any of it. He had heard the 2-year-old girl, Amanda, say, "Uncle Nick hurts Mom." And while he knew a toddler's testimony was not something you could build an entire case on, the way she had said it and the stabbing gesture she had made at her own neck was incredibly compelling, especially since Rhonda had been found stabbed to death. So Brooks pushed back at Nick. He said if Nick's alibi was that he was too drunk to have committed the murder, then how could he be so sure he hadn't done it? If he was drunk enough to have gaps in his memory, then it was just as likely that he could have killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout. But Nick just shook his head and kept saying, no. No seemed to be his answer for every question Brooks asked him. As the hours ticked by, the detective grew more and more frustrated with the constant denials. Finally, he decided to play his trump card. He told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. He painted a vivid picture for him, telling him to imagine that little girl on a witness stand in a courtroom with some defense lawyer poking and prodding her, forcing her to relive the most traumatic event of her entire life, the murder of her own mother. When he said that, a visible crack appeared in Nick's wall of denial. It was clear the image deeply disturbed him. Finally, a little after midnight, after 6 straight hours of interrogation, Nick agreed to take a lie detector test. When the results came back, the machine indicated that Nick was being deceptive. He had failed. But even then, instead of confessing, Nick dug in his heels and swore that he was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last and most serious threat he could think of. He told Nick that if he didn't confess right then and there, he could be facing the death penalty. At that, Nick visibly cracked. The threat of execution seemed to shatter his resolve. After a long, heavy silence, Nick finally said that maybe, just maybe, he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From that point on, Brooks kept pushing and pushing relentlessly. Around 5 in the morning, Nick finally broke down completely and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between his visits to the 2 bars. He claimed he had tried to kiss her, but she had pulled away and grabbed a knife. He said that when he tried to take the knife away from her, he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for the murder of Rhonda Boggs. Later that morning, Chief Forchie stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and proudly announced that his officers had caught Rhonda's killer and secured a full confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office, finishing up paperwork on the case, when a secretary stuck her head in the door and told him there was a phone call for him. Brooks picked it up. The man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. He said he was a bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he was calling because he did not believe for a second that Nick was guilty. Bob told a strange story. He said that on the evening Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. Bob said Chris had been acting very nervous and agitated. He was pacing around Bob's living room, chain-smoking cigarettes, and just seemed like his mind was a million miles away. Bob then revealed that Chris Williams had a history with Rhonda and Dave. In the past, he had actually robbed their house, stealing a bunch of band equipment and selling it for drug money. So, when Bob saw on the news that Rhonda was dead and her house had been robbed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Chris must have been involved. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. Brooks wrote down all the information and thanked Bob for the tip, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take it. After all, they already had a signed confession from their primary suspect. Still, he discussed it with Chief Forchie, and the chief decided they should re-interview Rhonda's daughter just to cover all their bases. A few days later, about 2 weeks after the murder, Chief Forchie was waiting by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. The same social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was interviewing her again, and she was supposed to call him with an update at any minute. Forchie was hoping, praying, that the little girl would just repeat the same story she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and he picked it up, he learned that was not what happened. The social worker told him that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, the little girl did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forchie heard this, a wave of anxiety washed over him. He had been afraid from the beginning that a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness. She could just be throwing out any name that popped into her head. But he also thought it was a bizarre coincidence. Of all the people she could have named, she said Bob, the same name as the man who had just called the station trying to point the finger at someone else. Something just felt off. But as Forchie thought about it, he decided it didn't really change the fundamentals of their case. Nick had confessed. He had admitted to doing it. They didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges stick. So, 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick Robinson on murder charges, and then, to the complete and utter surprise of the investigators, Nick pled not guilty. He was now officially claiming that police had coerced him into a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called the Merry Melody in Columbus, Ohio. He walked up to the counter, pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and showed the bartender a photograph inside. He asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the picture. The bartender glanced down at the photo for a second, then looked back up at Sauer and nodded. He said yes, that was Nick Robinson. He said Nick had been in the bar 8 months ago, on the night of the murder. The bartender then said he had been waiting for the police to come and talk to him because he knew for a fact that Nick was there that night. Sauer was a little taken aback by how certain the bartender was. He asked him how could he be so sure it was him, and how could he possibly remember that specific night so clearly after all this time. But the bartender had a quick and convincing answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick so vividly was because Nick had been wearing a very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night. It had an obscene joke printed on it about women's bodies. It was the kind of shirt you just don't forget. The bartender said Nick had stayed at the bar on the night of the murder until at least 10:15, maybe even 10:30. He was absolutely certain of the time. And so, the bartender said again that he was just surprised it had taken this long for law enforcement to come and confirm Nick's whereabouts. Sauer closed his folder, thanked the bartender, and set his business card down on the counter. When the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised. Matt Sauer was not a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he had been hired by Nick Robinson's family to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be an uphill battle. Nick had already confessed to the murder. But he was hoping this interview with the bartender would be the first step in poking a massive hole in the prosecution's case against him. Now that he had this solid testimony, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of the murder, the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he got there, he showed the staff the same photograph. And just like the bartender at the Merry Melody, they all remembered Nick as well. They confirmed he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder. And they remembered him for the exact same reason, his distinctive t-shirt. At that moment, Sauer knew he was onto something big. The prosecution's entire case was built on a timeline where Nick left the Merry Melody bar, drove to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing the shirt. Sauer thought, if Nick had violently stabbed Rhonda to death in between his visits to these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't the staff at the second bar have remembered not just the distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that was soaked in blood? That's a detail no one would forget. But they didn't mention it. They just said he was wearing that shirt. A few days later, Sauer drove back to the Merry Melody bar. But this time, he didn't go inside. He pulled his car into their parking lot, took out a stopwatch, and started it. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove the exact route to the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he pulled into their parking lot, he stopped the watch. The drive had taken him just about 45 minutes. According to the prosecution's timeline, Nick had left the Merry Melody, murdered Rhonda, and then driven to the Fairview, all within a window of 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauer's simple experiment with his stopwatch proved that was physically impossible. There was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed a violent murder, and then made it to the second bar in that amount of time. It just couldn't be done. Which meant Nick's alibi was airtight. He could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who was. Matt Sauer took the evidence he had gathered to Nick's defense attorney. The attorney then presented it to the judge and made a crucial request. They asked for a court order to test a key piece of evidence that, for some reason, the Pascala police had never bothered to send to the crime lab, the murder weapon itself. The judge agreed, and the knife was sent for testing. A month later, in January of 2003, the results came back from the lab. They discovered there was DNA on the knife from an unknown individual, someone other than Rhonda. Back in 2003, DNA databases were not what they are today. You couldn't just run an unknown profile against a massive database. You had to have a suspect to compare it to. But they were able to test the DNA against a sample from Nick, and the results were definitive. The DNA on the murder weapon was not his. This cast serious doubt on Nick as the killer, but it still wasn't enough to get the charges dropped. Not until Sauer could figure out who that DNA belonged to. So Sauer went back to digging through the police files. He quickly realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at. There was Rhonda's husband, Dave, who had been flagged by Rhonda's own sister on day one. He couldn't have done it himself, but he could have asked someone to do it for him. That meant all of Dave's friends, acquaintances, and even people he met in jail were potential suspects. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had robbed their house before to get drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had called in the tip about Chris. At one point, Rhonda's daughter had even said the name Bob. Any one of them could have been the killer. But because the police had focused so narrowly on Nick, the investigation was essentially starting over from square one almost 9 months after the crime. The real killer could be someone the police had never even heard of. With so little to go on, Sauer decided to focus on the one concrete thing he had, a list of the items that had been stolen from Rhonda's house. He decided he would try to track down those items, hoping they would lead him to the person who actually committed the murder. A few days later, Sauer found himself walking slowly down the aisle of a pawn shop in Columbus, scanning the shelves for any of the items from his list. But just like all the other pawn shops he had visited that day, he came up empty. He was beginning to think it was a dead end. It was possible these stolen items were never pawned, or maybe they were pawned in another state. But it seemed most likely they would be somewhere in the general area. After visiting several more pawn shops and finding nothing, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head home, feeling frustrated. On his drive back, he was stopped at a red light. As he sat there idling, he happened to look out his window and saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office, a DMV. The sight of it triggered something in his mind. He remembered reading in the case file that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But according to the same file, that suspect already owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car? On a whim, Sauer pulled into the DMV parking lot. He went inside, walked up to a clerk, and asked them to look up the records for that specific blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number. The clerk typed it into the computer and quickly found that on the 30th of April, 2002, just one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that exact blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus named Letitia Gordon. Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house. He knocked on the door. The woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as a private investigator, but she also didn't seem surprised to see him. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was about the blue Cadillac she had bought. She explained that she had purchased the car from a stranger right off the street. He had offered to sell it to her for just $300, an offer that was too good to pass up. However, when she got home with her new car, she started cleaning it out and found a pile of stuff in the back seat that the seller had left behind. It included clothes, jewelry, and a purse. Inside that purse, she found a photo ID. The name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And with that, Sauer was finally able to piece together what really happened on the night of the 28th of April, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her daughter, her killer parked their blue Cadillac just down the street. That killer, desperate and in a rage, stormed over to Rhonda's house, stomped up her driveway, and rang the doorbell. When Rhonda opened the door, she looked confused and frightened to see this person on her doorstep. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her, walked into her kitchen, and immediately started digging through her purse, which was sitting on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a steak knife from the knife block and stabbed her in the chest. Rhonda fell to the ground. She tried to fight back, to stand up, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her again and again until she stopped moving. The killer stood up, backing away from Rhonda's body, which now lay in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Then they simply continued to ransack the house, stealing whatever money and valuables they could find. As they were about to leave, they saw Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda, standing silently in the hallway watching them. The killer paid the child no mind, hurried right past her and out the door, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. The next morning, they sold that car to a woman on the street for quick cash, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and her jewelry in the back. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate, the same man who had robbed them once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack cocaine and desperately needed money for his next fix. Rhonda had simply gotten in his way. Chris was arrested and charged with Rhonda's murder. On the 28th of March 2005, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder, with a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and for escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were finally dropped. For Nick, the entire ordeal was life-changing. Once he was free and back home, he stopped drinking completely. He returned to his job, and he filed a lawsuit against the city of Pascala for $3 million in damages for the wrongful arrest and the coerced confession that nearly cost him his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Our story begins back in 1986. Tom Hawks was a 39-year-old man, a father to 2 teenage boys. He'd been married before to the boys' mother, but that relationship had ended in divorce. He was living in Newport Beach, California, focused on his work and on raising his sons. One day, Tom and his boys were at a local chili cook-off, a classic neighborhood event. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on a woman he'd never seen before. She was absolutely stunning, and Tom found himself just staring at her, completely captivated. He looked for so long that eventually she noticed him. She glanced up, met his gaze, and then gave a little smile, blushed, and looked away. Tom was instantly embarrassed. He'd been caught. But instead of just shrinking away, he had to go over and talk to her. And so Tom, who was this ruggedly handsome, muscular guy with a fantastic mustache, walked right across the lawn and introduced himself. The woman was all smiles. She told him her name was Jackie, that she was 29 years old, and that she was single. From that very first conversation, the two of them just clicked. They fell for each other hard and fast. A few years later, in 1989, they got married in front of 150 of their friends and family. It was a beautiful day, the start of a new life together. After the wedding, Jackie moved in with Tom and his 2 sons. And even though the boys had a mother who was still in their lives, they started calling Jackie Mom. It just felt natural. Jackie wasn't just living with them, she was completely devoted to them. She was kind, loving, and poured her heart into being a mother figure. There was a deeper reason for this. When Jackie was 22, she had been in a terrible motorcycle accident. The internal injuries she suffered were severe, and they left her unable to have children of her own. This had been a source of deep sadness for her, as it was something she had always dreamed of. So, when she had the chance to be a mother to Tom's boys, she embraced it with everything she had. And she was wonderful at it. The house was filled with warmth and love. Over the years, Tom and Jackie raised the 2 boys into fine young men. And then, in 2002, the time came for them to leave the nest. The boys were all grown up and ready to start their own lives. For any parent, this is a bittersweet moment. Tom and Jackie suddenly found themselves as empty nesters. So much of their lives for the past decade and a half had been centered around being parents. The house felt quiet and empty. But they had been planning for this day. For years, they had been carefully putting money aside. Their big dream, the one they talked about late at night, was to retire, buy a yacht, and spend their days sailing up and down the coasts of California and Mexico. Tom and Jackie were not wealthy people by any means. Tom had worked as a probation officer, a tough but not particularly high-paying job. But what they lacked in high income, they made up for in discipline. They were incredible savers. They lived frugally, always with their goal in mind. They saved almost every penny they could. And so, in 2002, with their sons out on their own, Tom and Jackie put their plan into action. They sold their house in Newport Beach. The money from the sale, combined with all their years of careful saving, gave them just enough to buy a small used yacht. It wasn't a glamorous multi-million-dollar vessel you see in movies. It was a bit beat up, in need of some love, but to them, it was perfect. They named it the Well-Deserved, a testament to all their years of hard work. They adored that boat. As soon as it was theirs, they moved all of their belongings on board. This wasn't just a boat, it was their new home. They spent the next few months meticulously cleaning, organizing, and upgrading every little thing they could within their budget. Tom was known for being incredibly neat and orderly, and he poured that energy into their new home. By the summer of that year, the yacht was beautiful. It was cozy and comfortable, and it had their personal touch everywhere you looked. It was a home. For the next 2 years, Tom and Jackie lived their dream. They sailed up and down the coast, from the sunny shores of California down to the vibrant waters of Mexico. They watched sunsets from the deck, they fished for their dinner, they drank cocktails together under the stars. They were truly happy, enjoying the retirement they had worked so hard for. Then, in 2004, they got some wonderful, unexpected news. One of their sons called to tell them that he and his partner were expecting a baby. Tom and Jackie were going to be grandparents for the first time. They were overjoyed. Especially Jackie. Remember, she had never been able to have her own biological children. The idea of being a grandmother, of getting to hold and love a new baby, filled her with a profound joy. And so, even though they were loving their life on the yacht, they made a big decision. They decided it was time to sell the Well-Deserved. They would take the money from the sale and buy a house on land again so they could be close to their son and their new grandbaby. Family was everything to them. In November of that year, they placed an ad in a fishing magazine to sell their yacht. They were asking for around $500,000. It wasn't long before they got a response. A young couple who said they had saved up some cash expressed serious interest and offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were thrilled. This was happening so fast. They called their 2 sons to share the good news. They told them they had a buyer, the sale would be finalized in the next couple of days, and they'd be in touch soon after. The sons were happy for them and expected to hear from their parents any day. But a couple of days passed, and there was no call. Then, a few more days. The sons started calling Tom and Jackie, but their phones just rang and rang or went straight to voicemail. This was completely out of character. Tom and Jackie were always in constant contact with their family. They would never just go silent, especially not with such big news. As the silence stretched on, a sense of unease started to grow. When Tom's brother Jim heard what was going on, his instincts kicked in. Jim was a retired police chief, and he knew when something wasn't right. He got in his car and drove straight to Newport Beach. He thought maybe the sale hadn't gone through yet. Maybe Tom and Jackie were still on the yacht, and there was some simple explanation. Jim arrived at the Newport Beach harbor with a friend. They made their way to the dock where the Well-Deserved was moored. They walked down the floating platform, and there it was. As they got closer, it seemed like the boat was empty. There were no lights on, no sounds coming from inside. But as Jim stood there, looking at his brother's pride and joy, his trained eye started noticing little things that were wrong. He saw lines the ropes used to tie up the boat hanging messily over the side. They should have been neatly coiled and stowed away. Tom was incredibly meticulous about his boat. He would never, ever leave lines hanging like that. It was like seeing a perfectly made bed with pillows thrown on the floor. It was just wrong. Then Jim noticed a couple of tarps that were used to cover some of the control panels on the deck. They had been taken off, but just left in a pile instead of being put back on. Again, this was not something Tom or Jackie would do. They took pristine care of their boat. And then he saw some dirty towels hanging out of one of the portholes, the small round windows on the side of the hull. The overall impression was one of sloppiness, of carelessness, and that just wasn't Tom and Jackie. Jim and his friend came to a conclusion. The sale must have gone through. These new owners were clearly not as neat as his brother. That must be why the boat was a mess. So, Jim's main concern was still finding Tom and Jackie. He figured the new owners were the last people to see them. He pulled out one of his own business cards and wrote a note on the back. He explained that he was looking for the new owners because his brother and sister-in-law who had sold them the boat were now missing. He asked them to please call him, and he tucked the cards somewhere visible on the boat. Jim and his friend then left the dock and started to head out of the area, feeling frustrated and worried. But then Jim's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered it. On the other end of the line was a young woman. She said her name was Jennifer De Leon. She told Jim that she and her husband had just bought the yacht and she had found his business card. She said that just like Jim, she and her husband were also trying to get in touch with the Hawks. Jennifer explained that after they took possession of the boat, they realized there were a few controls and switches they didn't know how to operate. They needed to ask Tom to explain how everything worked. She also said they had found some of Tom and Jackie's personal belongings, things that had been left behind in a couple of drawers. She wanted to return them. She sounded concerned and helpful. She told Jim, "I'm trying to get in touch with them and I can't." Jim asked Jennifer when she or her husband had last seen Tom and Jackie. She told him the last time was on November 15th when they had finalized the sale. She described a scene where she and her husband literally gave Tom and Jackie a suitcase full of cash. After the money and paperwork were exchanged, she said they watched Tom and Jackie get into their car and simply drive away. Jim asked her if she had any idea where they might have been going. Jennifer said they hadn't had many personal conversations with the Hawks. It was mostly business. But she did recall Tom mentioning that he and Jackie were planning to buy a house in a town in Mexico that bordered Arizona. Apparently, one of their sons lived in Arizona, the one who was about to have a baby, and they wanted to be close by. The story seemed plausible enough. It lined up with what the family knew about their plans. Jim thanked Jennifer for the information and asked her to call him immediately if she heard from them. Jennifer said the same thing back to him. "If you hear from them, please let me know. I really need to talk to them too." They hung up, and Jim was left with this uneasy feeling. Something still felt off. Then he remembered someone else who might have information. Her name was Patricia. For the past couple of years, while Tom and Jackie were out sailing, they knew they wouldn't always have good internet access to manage their finances. So they had hired Patricia, who was also a friend, to handle their bills, pay their taxes, and basically manage their money. Jim got her number and gave her a call. He asked Patricia if she had spoken to Tom or Jackie recently. She said no, she hadn't. Jim explained the whole situation, the sudden silence, the sale of the boat. Then he asked her a critical question. Had Tom or Jackie made a large deposit into any of their bank accounts recently, they should have just received nearly $500,000 in cash. Patricia checked their accounts right then and there. She came back to the phone and told Jim no. There have been no recent deposits at all. Now, Jim and Patricia were really confused. Why would Tom and Jackie, two of the most responsible and financially disciplined people they knew, be driving around with a suitcase full of cash and not deposit it immediately? It made absolutely no sense. After he hung up with Patricia, Jim's feeling of unease turned into a deep sense of dread. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He called the Newport Beach Police Department and officially reported Tom and Jackie Hawks as missing. Once the missing persons report was filed, the Newport Beach Police started their investigation. The first thing they did was run a background check on the new owners of the yacht, the De Leons. They looked into the 5-year-old husband, Skylar De Leon. And right away, a major red flag went up. Skylar was a felon. He had a prior arrest and conviction for armed robbery and had even served time in prison for it. This immediately made the police suspicious. Skylar and his wife were the last known people to have seen the Hawks. Now, finding out the husband had a violent criminal past set off all sorts of alarm bells. So, the police sent a detective down to the dock to have a look around the yacht. The detective walked down the floating platform just as Jim had done and approached the well-deserved. From the outside, it was quiet. The detective peered through one of the windows, trying to get a look inside. And through the glass, they thought they saw what looked like a bloody handprint on one of the interior surfaces. That was more than enough to get a search warrant. Before long, the boat wasn't quiet anymore. It was swarming with police and forensic investigators, combing over every inch of the vessel. But it turned out to be a dead end. The bloody handprint was just a bit of rust that, from a distance, had looked like something sinister. The rest of the boat was searched from top to bottom, but they found nothing else of any evidentiary value. With no physical evidence from the boat, the police knew they had to talk to Skylar De Leon directly. They contacted him and told him he needed to come to the station to explain exactly what happened during his final interaction with the Hawks. Skylar agreed and came in. He seemed totally cooperative. He sat down with detectives and told them his story. He said he saw the ad for the yacht in a fishing magazine and contacted Tom Hawks. They met up and took the boat out for a sea trial, which is like a test drive for a big time in boat. Skylar told the detectives that during the trial, he told Tom he liked the boat and wanted to buy it. He then described the final meeting on November 15th. He said he, his pregnant wife Jennifer, and their young daughter went to the parking lot near the dock. He also brought along a notary to handle the paperwork and another friend who was just there as a witness. He said Tom and Jackie Hawks showed up, and the De Leons handed them a suitcase full of cash. He said Tom and Jackie then signed the sales documents with the notary, officially transferring ownership of the boat. After that, Skylar said Tom and Jackie took their money, got into their SUV, and drove away, presumably heading for Mexico. The police asked Skylar the obvious question: how could a 5-year-old guy afford a $500,000 yacht in cash? Skylar's first explanation was a bit strange. He claimed that back in the 1990s, he was a child actor. He said he was an extra on the popular TV show Power Rangers and had made a lot of money, which he had saved all these years. But as he was telling this story, he suddenly stopped himself. He looked at the detectives and said, "You know what? That's not really the truth." He then proceeded to tell them a completely different and much more shocking story. He said the real reason he had the money was because he had stolen it. He confessed that the armed robbery he was convicted of was against a drug kingpin. He said that before he got arrested and sent to prison, he had managed to hide all the stolen money. After he served his time and got out, he went back to his hiding spot and retrieved it. But the money was stolen, drug money, so it was hot. He couldn't just start spending it. He needed a way to launder it, to make it look legitimate. And that, he said, was why he was buying the yacht. His plan was to use the dirty cash to buy the boat, which would effectively turn the cash into an asset. Then he would sell the yacht and get clean money in return. The detectives listening to this were stunned. Skylar De Leon had just walked into a police station and confessed to a major federal crime, money laundering. It was a bizarre turn of events. But the police made a strategic decision. They told Skylar that because he was being so open and helpful with their missing persons investigation, they weren't going to charge him with money laundering. They wanted to keep him talking. So they let him go. After Skylar left, the police brought in the other people who were supposedly there for the final sale. They interviewed his wife Jennifer, the notary, and the friend who was there as a witness. They asked all three of them to describe what happened. And they all told the exact same story. The meeting in the parking lot, the suitcase of cash, the paperwork being signed, and Tom and Jackie driving off. The only small difference in their stories was about Tom and Jackie's demeanor. Skylar had said Tom seemed anxious and paranoid about carrying so much cash. But the notary said that, to her, Tom and Jackie seemed completely normal and happy. With four people all telling a consistent story, the police felt like they had hit a wall. They had no body, no crime scene, and a plausible story about the Hawks taking their money and leaving the country. They decided to go to the media for help. They released a bulletin with pictures of Tom and Jackie and their SUV, asking the public to come forward with any information. And it worked. A few days later, a call came in from an older couple living in Mexico. They told the police that the Hawks SUV was parked on the street right across from their house. Mexican and American authorities rushed to the location. They approached the house where the SUV was parked, half expecting to find Tom and Jackie inside. But when they knocked on the door, a man answered who they didn't recognize. The police asked him about the SUV parked outside. The man said, "Oh, that's my friend's car." They asked if his friend's name was Tom or Jackie Hawks. The man looked confused and said, "No, who's that?" "The car belongs to my friend, Skylar De Leon." This was the moment everything changed. This was the piece that shattered Skylar's story. He had told police point blank that the last time he saw the Hawks, they were driving away in that very SUV. But clearly, that wasn't true. Somehow, after they supposedly drove off to Mexico, Skylar had gotten possession of their car and had given it to a friend. The police in Newport Beach now had what they needed. They used Skylar's on-camera confession to money laundering as the basis for an arrest warrant. They brought him in, and with him now in custody, they obtained a warrant to search his home. Inside the house he shared with Jennifer, they found a trove of items belonging to the Hawks. They found their laptops, their video cameras, and other personal effects, things that a couple starting a new life would never have just left behind. Despite this mountain of evidence connecting him to the Hawks' disappearance, Skylar maintained his innocence. He insisted it was all just a big misunderstanding. And while he was in jail being grilled by detectives, his wife Jennifer was out in public doing the same thing. She was even going on television talk shows proclaiming her husband's innocence and saying this was all a huge mistake. She claimed they were just as worried about Tom and Jackie as everyone else. But the police weren't buying it. They knew Skylar was hiding something big. The problem was, he wasn't talking. So, they decided to change tactics. They went back to the other two witnesses from that supposed final sale, the notary and the friend. They brought the notary, a woman named Kathleen Harris, back in for questioning. Kathleen had a clean record and a long, successful career as a notary. She sat down, and the police asked her again to describe her final interaction with Tom and Jackie. She repeated the same story. They came, they signed, they took the cash, they left. But this time, the police pressed her. They questioned every single detail, poking holes in her story, applying intense pressure. And finally, under the weight of it, Kathleen broke. She confessed that she had lied. She told them she had never even met Tom and Jackie Hawks. She said Skylar De Leon had paid her cash up front to backdate sales documents that had already been signed by someone else. She had no idea what had actually happened to the missing couple. Next, the police went and found the other witness, the friend. His name was Alonzo Mason. They brought him into an interrogation room and asked him the same questions. At first, Alonzo stuck to the script. He repeated the story about the cash, the SUV, and the drive to Mexico. But the police stopped him mid-sentence. They told him they had just spoken to the notary and she had admitted the entire thing was a fabrication. They told Alonzo they knew he was lying. As soon as he was caught, Alonzo clammed up. He clearly did not want to say another word. The police knew this was their chance to break the case wide open. They made a deal with him. They told Alonzo that if he told them everything he knew about what happened to Tom and Jackie, they would make sure he received a heavily reduced sentence. And so, Alonzo agreed to talk. And the story he told was a waking nightmare. Alonzo was a young, impressionable guy in his early 20s. He worked as a jailer, and that's where he had met Skylar De Leon back when Skylar was serving time for armed robbery. After Skylar got out, the two of them somehow stayed in touch and became friends. In November of 2004, Skylar pulled Alonzo aside and told him a wild story. He confessed to Alonzo that he was secretly an international assassin. He claimed that people paid him to kill other people, but only bad people. And then he told Alonzo he had a new contract on two very bad people, Tom and Jackie Hawks. He said he needed help to carry out the job, and if Alonzo helped him, he would give him $1 million. Alonzo, for whatever reason, believed him and agreed to help. So, on November 15th, the story Alonzo told was very different from the one police had heard before. Skylar, Alonzo, and a third man Skylar had recruited, a big, intimidating gang member named John Kennedy, all went to the dock parking lot. They weren't there to finalize a sale. They were there to meet Tom and Jackie for a sea trial. But when Tom and Jackie arrived, Tom's instincts kicked in. Tom had been a probation officer for years. He was used to sizing people up, and he immediately got a bad feeling from these three men. He started to get apprehensive about getting on a small boat with them in the middle of the ocean. He even started talking about maybe rescheduling, saying that today wasn't a good day. Skylar saw that he was about to lose them. He knew Tom and Jackie were uneasy. So he said, "Hey, hold on a minute. I'm just going to step aside and make a quick phone call." Skylar called his wife Jennifer, who was waiting nearby. A few minutes later, Jennifer pulled into the parking lot. She was holding their 1-year-old baby girl. As soon as she walked over to the group, the entire dynamic changed. Jackie saw the baby and her face lit up. She immediately wanted to hold the baby, and she thought Jennifer was so sweet and lovely. Jackie's guard came down completely. Tom saw how at ease his wife was, and he started to loosen up too. Before long, Tom was telling Skylar, "You know what? Today is fine. Let's go do the sea trial." It was a trap, and they had just walked right into it. The group started making their way to the yacht. But just as they were about to board, Jennifer said, "Oh, I can't go. The baby is getting fussy. I need to take her home. I'll see you guys when you get back." By this point, Tom and Jackie had already mentally committed. Even if a little bit of apprehension returned now that they would be alone with the three men, they put their trust in the De Leons. They got on board the Well-Deserved with Skylar, Alonzo, and John Kennedy. Tom, being the experienced boater, took the helm and started piloting them out toward open water. After they were far from shore, with no other boats or land in sight, Skylar and John Kennedy approached Tom. They said they wanted to show him something down in the lower level of the boat. So Tom went with them down the stairs and into the bedroom. While they were down there, Jackie and Alonzo were up in the galley, the boat's kitchen, which was located directly above the bedroom. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted from below. Banging, shouting. Jackie heard it, but Alonzo knew exactly what it was. It was the sound of Skylar and John attacking Tom. This was his cue. Alonzo lunged at Jackie. Before she could even process what was happening, he had thrown her to the ground, wrenched her hands behind her back, and snapped a pair of handcuffs on her wrists. As soon as Jackie was subdued, Skylar and John came back up the stairs. Tom wasn't with them. They grabbed Jackie and forced her down into the bedroom. There, she saw her husband. Tom was also in handcuffs, lying on his back on the bed. They threw Jackie onto the bed next to him. Jackie immediately turned to Skylar, her voice filled with confusion and terror. She said, "Why are you doing this to us?" "We just met your wife. I just held your baby." "Why?" "All we want to do is go back to land and be with our children and our new grandchild." "Please." But Skylar showed no emotion. He just turned to Alonzo and ordered him to put duct tape over both of their mouths and their eyes. While Alonzo did that, Skylar went back upstairs to pilot the boat further out, heading for the deepest part of the ocean he could find. Down in the bedroom, Alonzo remembered looking over at Tom and Jackie. Even in this horrific situation, Tom was trying to comfort his wife. He had managed to move his cuffed hand just enough to be able to stroke Jackie's hand. He was murmuring to her through the tape on his mouth, trying to tell her it was going to be okay, that no matter what happened, they would be together. Eventually, the boat's engines cut out. They had arrived at their destination. Skylar called down to John and Alonzo and told them to bring Tom and Jackie up onto the deck. They marched the couple up the stairs and out into the open air. There, on the deck of their own boat, Skylar forced them to sign the sales documents for the yacht. He also made them sign additional paperwork that gave him power of attorney, giving him access to all their bank accounts. As they were signing, Jackie did something remarkable. On one of the signature lines, she intentionally misspelled her last name. She wrote Hawk instead of Hawks, leaving off the S. It was a small act of defiance, a message to the future that she had signed these papers under duress. After the documents were signed, the three men led Tom and Jackie to the back of the boat. Skylar then turned to Alonzo and said, loud enough for Tom and Jackie to hear, "Go to the front of the boat and get the anchor." In that moment, Tom and Jackie knew exactly what was about to happen. Jackie began pleading for their lives again, begging them to let them go, to let them see their grandchild. Tom, in a final surge of adrenaline, managed to shake free from John's grip and kicked Skylar hard in the groin. But John immediately jumped on Tom and Jackie, subduing them both. He then positioned them so they were sitting on the deck, back to back, their handcuffs linked together. Just then, Alonzo returned, dragging the heavy boat anchor behind him. He dropped it on the deck next to Tom and Jackie. Skylar then picked up the long anchor chain. He found the very end of the chain, the part not attached to the anchor, and he reached down and connected it to the handcuffs that bound Tom and Jackie together. Once he was sure it was secure, Skylar stood up, walked over to the anchor, and with a grunt of effort, he lifted it and heaved it over the side of the boat. As soon as the heavy anchor hit the water, all Tom and Jackie would have heard was the horrifying sound of the loose chain being violently ripped off the deck and pulled down into the dark water. The chain scraped and ground against the wooden railing of the boat until finally it pulled taut. In an instant, it yanked Tom and Jackie across the deck towards the side. Alonzo would later say that when this happened, Jackie's head slammed against the inside of the boat's railing with a loud, sickening crack. And then Skylar, Alonzo, and John just stood there and watched. They watched as Tom and Jackie desperately fought against the immense weight pulling them into the ocean. Tom tried to grab on to anything he could, trying to hold himself and his wife on the boat. But the weight of the anchor, combined with the rocking of the boat on the waves, was just too much. Slowly, agonizingly, Tom and Jackie were pulled up over the railing and into the water. They were fully alive, fully conscious, as they began their terrifyingly fast descent to the bottom of the ocean, 3,500 feet below. Alonzo told the police that as soon as Tom and Jackie disappeared beneath the waves, Skylar let out a loud woohoo. He ran to the edge of the boat and stared down into the water where they had vanished, grinning and laughing like a giddy child. When the last of the bubbles disappeared and the water went calm, Skylar just laughed again, turned around, and walked back to the cockpit to pilot the boat back to shore. And Jennifer, though she wasn't on the boat, was just as guilty. It turns out the entire scheme was her idea. She wanted more money, and this was how she planned to get it. When she showed up in the parking lot with her baby, it was a calculated act of manipulation designed to lure Tom and Jackie into the trap. She knew exactly what was going to happen to them. In fact, while Skylar was out on the boat, before, during, and after the murders, he was on the phone with her, giving her updates and getting her advice on what to do next. Perhaps one of the most chilling details of this case came from the video camera police found in Skylar and Jennifer's house. It was Tom and Jackie's camera. They had used it for the past 2 years to document their happy travels on the Well-Deserved. When the police played the tape that was inside, it began with footage shot by Jackie. She was filming the inside of their beloved boat, talking about how sad she was that this would be one of their last times on it. But she also talked about how happy she and Tom were, how they had found good buyers who would take care of their home, and how excited they were for their future, for their new grandbaby. And then, suddenly, the footage cuts. The image of Jackie's hopeful face is gone. It jumps to new footage showing Skylar and Jennifer at Thanksgiving dinner just days after the murders. They are playing with their daughter, laughing, having a wonderful time. They had taken the camera from the people they had just murdered in the most brutal way imaginable and simply recorded over their memories as if they didn't exist. They truly felt nothing. In the end, Alonzo Mason was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His sentence would have been much harsher, but because he cooperated and provided every detail of the horrific crime, the prosecution upheld their deal for a reduced sentence. Jennifer DeLeon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And for their roles as the masterminds and key perpetrators of this unspeakably cruel act, John Kennedy and Skylar DeLeon were both sentenced to death. Tom and Jackie Hawks were good, loving people who had worked their entire lives to achieve their dream. They were cheated out of their future, out of the chance to meet their grandchild, by a group of people who saw them not as human beings, but as an obstacle to a boat and some money. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.